Genghis Khan emerged in the late 12th century on the cold grasslands of eastern Mongolia, at a time when the Eurasian steppe was divided among rival tribes and shifting alliances. In the 1180s, the lands between the Onon River and the Karakorum River were marked by fragile loyalties, seasonal migrations, and constant negotiation over pasture and honor. To the south, the Jin dynasty ruled northern China from Zhongdu, present-day Beijing. To the west, the Khwarazmian Empire stretched across Transoxiana, its cities anchored along the Oxus River. Across this vast interior of Asia, no single power held lasting control of the steppe itself. Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan in 1206, was born into this unsettled world, likely around 1162, near the Dalun Boldog area by the Onon River. His early life unfolded in a landscape shaped by wind, frost, and open sky. Winter temperatures could drop far below freezing. Summer storms rolled across the grasslands without warning. Families moved with herds of horses, sheep, and cattle, living in felt-covered jurs supported by wooden lattice frames. Survival depended on mobility and cooperation. The late 12th century was also a period of political reorganization across Eurasia. The Song dynasty held southern China. The Abbasid Caliphate remained in Baghdad, though its authority was limited. Trade caravans crossed the Gobi Desert and the Tarim Basin, linking cities such as Samarkand and Kashgar. Yet the steppe itself stood outside these settled states. Power there rested on kinship networks, oath-bound alliances, and the ability to command loyalty in battle. When Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan at a Kurultai in 1206, near the source of the Onon, he did more than unite tribes. He reshaped the political structure of the steppe. Within 2 decades, his armies would reach the walls of Yanjing, cross the Sidaria, and enter the Caucasus. By the time of his death in 1227, near the Tangut capital of Yinchuan, the Mongol state had altered the balance of power from the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea. This is the story of how a leader formed in the harsh climate of the Mongolian plateau built a system that outlived him. It is a story grounded in specific places, Burkhan Khaldun, Karakorum, Bukhara, and in recorded years, 1206, 1215, 1227. It unfolds not as legend, but as the steady development of institutions, campaigns, and decisions that reshaped Eurasia. In the 12th century, the eastern Mongolian plateau stretched wide and unbroken between the Onon River and the Karakorum River. The land rose and fell in long, shallow folds. In winter, wind moved freely across the grasslands, carrying dry snow that settled into the hollows. Temperatures often dropped below -30°C. Summer brought short bursts of green growth, when feather grass and wild onion pushed through the soil and herds grazed in scattered lines across the horizon. North of the steppe stood the forested slopes of the Kentiai Mountains. Southward lay the gradual descent toward the Gobi Desert, where gravel plains replaced pasture and wells determined survival. The rivers themselves were not wide, but they marked essential lifelines. The Onon flowed through narrow valleys lined with birch and willow. In spring thaw, its banks swelled and cut into the earth, leaving layers of sediment visible in exposed ridges. Archaeological surveys near the upper Onon have revealed burial mounds covered in stone slabs, some measuring nearly 10 meters across, marking generations of pastoral families who had moved with the seasons. This environment shaped social order long before Temujin was born around 1162. The tribes of eastern Mongolia did not live within walls. They did not mark borders with stone fortifications. Their boundaries shifted with grazing routes and marriage alliances. Among the prominent groups were the Teachiad, the Merkit along the Selenga River, the Kerate, who ranged closer to the Orkhon Valley, and the Naiman, who occupied lands nearer the Altai Mountains. Each group was divided into lineages. Authority rested with clan leaders whose power depended on personal loyalty and the ability to distribute livestock, spoils, and protection. The jur, or felt tent, formed the center of daily life. Its wooden lattice frame could be collapsed and loaded onto carts pulled by oxen. The circular structure averaged about 5 meters in diameter. Roof poles converged into a central ring that allowed smoke from the hearth to escape. Thick layers of felt, pressed from sheep's wool, insulated families against the cold. Inside, saddles hung along the walls, bows were stored in leather cases, and wooden chests held clothing stitched from sheepskin or trade silk. Mobility was the key to survival. A household might own several dozen horses, along with sheep and goats. Mare's milk was fermented into airag in leather bags suspended from tent frames. Meat was dried into strips that could be carried during long rides. Children learned to sit on horseback before they could walk steadily on the ground. A composite bow, built from layered wood, horn, and sinew glued together with fish bladder adhesive, could measure just over a meter when unstrung. Its curved shape allowed it to store immense tension. At full draw, it could send an arrow through lamellar armor at close range. To the south, beyond the steppes' open horizon, the Jin dynasty ruled northern China from Zhongdu. In the 1140s and 1150s, Jin officials had conducted campaigns against the Tatars and other Mongolic groups, at times playing tribes against one another. Tribute missions moved back and forth across the frontier. Silk, metal tools, and grain entered the steppe. Horses and furs traveled south. These exchanges were rarely stable. A treaty one year could become a raid the next. The Tatars, settled in areas east of Lake Bure, were often aligned with the Jin court. Their position gave them leverage in regional politics. Tensions among tribes were rarely isolated events. A stolen herd near the Onon River could spark retaliation that reached across valleys and lasted for years. Alliances were sealed by marriage, but they could dissolve through insult or suspicion. The death of a leader frequently caused fragmentation, as sons and rivals competed for followers. In the Orkhon Valley, stone inscriptions from an earlier Turkic empire, the monuments of Bilge Kargan dating to the 8th century, still stood upright. Carved into tall slabs, some over 3 meters high, were records of rulers who had once united the steppe under a single banner. By the 12th century, those inscriptions had weathered under centuries of wind. Lichen marked their lower edges, yet their presence remained a reminder that unification was possible, even if it had not endured. The social fabric of the steppe relied on oath and exchange. A leader gathered followers not by fixed taxation, but by redistributing animals captured in raids. Loyalty was reinforced during shared hardship, winter scarcity, drought, or conflict. Without central administration, justice was negotiated through kin networks. Disputes over bride price or stolen livestock could escalate into blood feuds. Arbitration depended on respected elders rather than written codes. Across this landscape, the balance of power shifted constantly. In the 1170s, the Kherate under Togrul controlled important routes near the Toul River. The Nayman to the west managed trade corridors leading toward the Altai passes. The Merkit held territories north of the Selenga, where fishing supplemented herding. No tribe held dominance for long. Authority rose and fell with the fortunes of individual leaders. The steppe's openness created both freedom and vulnerability. Without mountains or city walls to shield them, communities relied on speed and awareness. Scouts could ride dozens of kilometers in a day, reading distant dust clouds for signs of approaching riders. Camps were arranged in loose circles, livestock grazing outward during daylight and drawn inward at night. Fires were kept low to avoid detection. By the time Temujin was born near Daloon Boldog along the Onon River, this system had existed for generations. It was resilient but fragile. It could support skilled leaders, yet it could not prevent cycles of revenge. It allowed mobility, yet it lacked mechanisms for sustained unity. The rivers continued their seasonal rise and fall. Herds grazed along the same valleys used by ancestors. The stone mounds remained in place, marking the dead beneath layers of earth and rock. This was the political and environmental world that preceded Genghis Khan. It was not empty land waiting for transformation. It was structured by habit, memory, and inherited patterns of rule. What changed in the early 13th century did not emerge from a void. It grew from the pressures already present across the grasslands, pressures shaped by climate, rivalry, and the constant need to survive. The steppe did not produce isolation, it produced movement. By the middle of the 12th century, mounted envoys rode between the Onon River and the Orkhon Valley, carrying news of marriages, disputes, and seasonal plans. A rider could cover 80 to 100 kilometers in a day if remounts were available. Paths were not marked by roads, but by memory, river bends, hill contours, and distant tree clusters that signaled water sources. In dry years, entire encampments shifted east toward the Argun River basin. In harsher winters, families clustered near forest edges in the Kentii Mountains, where wood could be cut for fuel and shelter could be found from wind. The tribes of eastern Mongolia formed loose confederations rather than fixed states. Among them, the Karaite held influence over lands stretching toward the Tool River, not far from present-day Ulaanbaatar. Their leader, Togrul, sometimes known in later sources as Ong Khan, controlled trade access points where steppe routes met Jin frontier markets. A camp under his authority could include hundreds of jurs arranged in widening circles, livestock grazing in layered bands beyond them. The largest encampments might stretch across several kilometers, marked by tethering posts and wagon tracks pressed into the earth. Authority depended on visible generosity. When a successful raid brought back horses or metal goods, distribution reinforced loyalty. Saddles with bronze fittings, iron stirrups forged in northern workshops, and silk garments traded from Zhongdu were not only practical items, they signaled status. A finely stitched deal lined with fur could show a leader's reach beyond the immediate tribe. A well-made sword with a straight iron blade, roughly 70 centimeters long, indicated access to skilled smiths or trade networks. The Jin dynasty, ruling northern China since 1115, maintained fortified lines along the steppe frontier. Sections of rammed earth wall and watchtowers stood in regions north of Datong. Some walls measured over 6 meters in height and were reinforced with timber beams. Frontier garrisons monitored movement and sought alliances among Mongolic groups to prevent unified resistance. Tatars living east of Lake Bure and near the Hulan region often received Jin recognition in exchange for cooperation against rival tribes. These arrangements did not bring stability. They introduced new tensions. When one tribe secured favorable trade access, others saw exclusion. A shipment of grain or iron tools could alter a balance of power. Metal arrowheads replaced older bone or stone tips in some camps. A lamella cuirass, constructed from small iron plates laced together with leather thongs, offered protection that reshaped close combat. Material differences widened political divides. The steppe climate intensified competition. Drought cycles recorded in tree-ring data from the Altai Mountains indicate periods of reduced rainfall in the late 12th century. When pasture thinned, herds weakened. A horse deprived of sufficient grass in autumn would struggle through winter. Loss of livestock meant loss of wealth and bargaining power. Raiding became not only an assertion of dominance, but a means of survival. Burial practices reflect this social structure. Excavations near the Selenga River have uncovered grave dug approximately 1.5 to 2 meters deep, lined with wooden planks. The deceased were placed with personal objects, arrowheads, belt buckles, sometimes a bridle. Stone cairns were built above, forming low mounds visible from a distance. These markers reinforced claims to land through memory. Ancestors anchored identity in a territory that otherwise had no fences. Seasonal gatherings provided moments of negotiation. At Kurultai assemblies, leaders and followers met in open valleys, often near reliable water sources. Horses were tethered in rows. Drums signaled announcements. Disputes were addressed before elders. Marriage arrangements were formalized through exchange of livestock, sometimes counted in dozens of sheep or several horses. Oaths were sworn publicly, binding men to mutual defense. Yet these gatherings also revealed fragility. A leader who failed to protect his followers risked desertion. Loyalty was personal, not institutional. When a chief died, succession could fracture into competing claims. Sons from different wives might gather separate supporters. In such moments, alliances shifted rapidly. The Merkit, dwelling north of the Selenga, and extending toward Lake Baikal, controlled fishing zones and forest resources. Birch bark containers and wooden sleds used in winter hunts distinguished their material culture slightly from southern tribes. The Nayman, further west near the Altai passes, had closer contact with Central Asian trade routes. Some Nayman elites used written scripts derived from Uyghur models, inscribing brief records on wooden tablets or parchment. These variations did not produce cultural isolation. Riders moved between territories, women married across tribal lines, captives were absorbed into new clans. A child raised in one encampment might later fight against it. The fluidity of identity was both strength and instability. Wind defined daily experience. On open plains near the Onon River, gusts could reach 40 kilometers per hour, flattening grass and lifting dust. Camps were positioned with doors facing south to avoid the strongest northern winds. Hearth smoke escaped through the roof ring, leaving a darkened circle in the felt above. Inside, daily routines followed steady rhythms: milking at dawn, herding at midday, tool repair in the evening. This environment required constant awareness. Scouts climbed low ridges to scan the horizon. A distant movement could signal approaching traders or raiders. Horses were kept ready, reins looped near tent entrances. Children practiced archery with smaller bows, sometimes measuring only 70 centimeters in length, crafted to build strength gradually. By the 1180s, these overlapping networks, trade, rivalry, kinship, and resource management, formed a tightly woven system across eastern Mongolia. It had endured for generations, yet it lacked a central structure capable of absorbing sustained growth or extended conquest. It functioned through equilibrium. When that balance tilted, the consequences moved quickly. Temujin entered this world not as an outsider, but as a member of the Borjigin lineage within the Teocheid sphere. His early life would unfold amid these shifting alliances, shaped by the same winds, rivers, and rivalries that governed all steppe families. The pressures already present: competition for pasture, dependence on trade, fragile succession, would become the conditions from which new forms of authority emerged. The steppe had memory. It carried stories of past confederations, including the earlier Turkic Khaganate centered in the Orkhon Valley during the 8th century. But by the late 12th century, unity was not an inherited structure. It was a possibility waiting to be attempted again. Long before Temujin's birth near the upper Onon River around 1162, the steppe had known periods of wider union. The memory of those earlier confederations did not survive in libraries or stone cities. It survived in monuments, scattered inscriptions, and stories carried in oral recitation. In the Orkhon Valley, roughly 360 kilometers west of the Onon, tall stone stelae stood upright in the open grassland. The inscriptions of Bilge-Khagan and Kul-Tijin, carved in 732 and 735, recorded the authority of the Gurktuik Khaganate. The stones rose over 3 meters high, their surfaces cut with vertical lines of old Turkic script. Though centuries had passed, travelers still encountered them. Lichens spread across the lower carvings, and wind had worn the edges smooth, yet the columns remained. They marked a time when the steppe had been governed by a single Khagan, whose authority stretched from the Altai Mountains to the fringes of northern China. By the 12th century, those earlier structures had long dissolved. Still, the presence of the monuments mattered. They stood near the Orkhon River, where pastureland remained fertile and water-steady through most seasons. Nearby archaeological remains include stone enclosures and post holes suggesting administrative camps from the Turkic era. These traces served as quiet reminders that unity was not unknown to the steppe. The Uyghur Khaganate followed the Gurktuiks in the 8th and 9th centuries, establishing a capital at Ordubalik around 744. Excavations at the site, near present-day Kar Balgaz, reveal mud brick walls nearly 10 meters thick in places and foundations of large rectangular halls. Fragments of painted plaster and ceramic roof tiles have been found among the ruins. When the Uyghur state collapsed in 840 under pressure from the Yenisei Kyrgyz, the urban structures gradually decayed. Timber beams rotted. Earthen ramparts softened back into the landscape. These earlier states had combined nomadic mobility with elements of sedentary administration. They adopted scripts, minted coins, and negotiated directly with Tang and later Chinese courts. Yet they also depended on the same ecological balance as later tribes. When climate patterns shifted or trade faltered, cohesion weakened. The 12th century steppe existed in the shadow of these precedents, but without their centralized institutions. Authority was dispersed. The Teocheid, the Borjigin, the Karaite, the Nayman, each maintained its own leadership line. When conflict broke out, there was no permanent council or fixed capital to mediate disputes. Environmental conditions reinforced decentralization. The Kentiai Mountains, rising to elevations over 2,000 meters, created forested barriers that limited large-scale agricultural settlement. Winters were long, often stretching from October to April. Snow could accumulate deeply in sheltered valleys, forming crusted layers that made grazing difficult. In such years, herds required relocation or risked starvation. A political system rooted in fixed boundaries would have struggled under these pressures. Near Lake Bure in the east, grasslands met patches of sandy soil. Archaeological surveys have identified burial sites from the 12th century with stone circles averaging 8 to 12 meters in diameter. Some grave contained iron stirrups and arrowheads with triangular barbs. The material culture shows continuity with earlier steppe traditions, portable, durable, and suited to mounted life. The absence of cities did not mean absence of structure. Tribal camps followed patterns shaped by rank and kinship. The most respected leader's jur stood at the center, facing south. To its right were the tents of close relatives, to the left, allied households. Herd animals grazed outward in loose arcs, with horses kept nearest for quick departure. The arrangement could shift within hours if movement became necessary. Trade routes tied the steppe to larger systems. Caravans moving between Zhongdu and Central Asia crossed through corridors near the Gobi Desert's northern edge. Camel caravans carried bolts of silk, iron cookware, and grain. In exchange, they acquired horses known for endurance across long distances. Some horses bred along the Onon River were valued for their ability to travel over 100 kilometers without rest. Such exchanges created indirect connections between Mongolian encampments and distant markets in Samarkand or Kaifeng. Still, no lasting confederation unified the tribes during the late 12th century. Rivalries hardened. The Tatars maintained contact with the Jin dynasty, receiving titles and goods in return for cooperation. The Karaite under Togrul sought to balance relations with both steppe neighbors and Chinese authorities. The Nayman guarded western approaches near the Altai passes. Tensions often turned into raids, swift attacks aimed at capturing livestock, weapons, or people. The landscape itself encouraged such tactics. Open plains allowed mounted archers to maneuver freely. A rider could approach from beyond visible range, using shallow depressions for cover. The composite bow, roughly 110 centimeters in length, when unstrung, delivered arrows capable of piercing thick leather armor. Battles were rarely prolonged sieges. They were rapid engagements defined by speed and coordination. Oral tradition preserved memory of earlier unity. Stories of great Khagans circulated around hearth fires. They were not recited as precise records, but as examples of strength and fortune. In these narratives, success depended on discipline and divine favor. Sacred mountains such as Birkenkalden held symbolic importance. Located in the Kentiai Range, its forested slopes and clear streams provided both physical refuge and spiritual meaning. Ritual offerings were made on its heights, binding clan identity to the land. By the time Temujin was born, the steppe carried both fragmentation and memory. It was accustomed to shifting power, but aware that broader union had once been possible. The material traces in the Orkhon Valley and the stories told in jurs at night formed a quiet backdrop to daily struggle. Nothing in the late 12th century guaranteed that unity would return. The tribes continued to negotiate, raid, and realign. Yet the environmental pressures, the competition for trade access, and the memory of earlier confederations created conditions in which a determined leader might attempt something larger. As the winds moved across the Onon Basin and herds grazed under open sky, the stage was already set. The steppe was neither chaotic nor orderly. It was balanced on movement. And within that movement, a child of the Borjigin lineage was growing toward events that would test every structure the grasslands had known. Temujin was born around 1162 near Dalun Boldog, a wooded rise close to the upper reaches of the Onon River in the Kentiai Mountains. The area lies where forest gives way to open grassland. Larch and birch trees cluster along narrow valleys. In early spring, meltwater runs cold and fast over stone beds. Even in summer, nights can turn sharply cool. The air at that elevation remains thin and clear, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp soil. His father, Yasuje of the Borjigin lineage, belonged to a minor but respected aristocratic line within the larger Teocheid sphere. Authority in this world was measured less by territory than by followers. A leader's strength could be counted in horses tethered near his camp, in warriors willing to answer his summons, and in marriage ties that extended beyond immediate kin. Yasuje had secured such ties when he abducted Huralun from the Merkit, an act consistent with steppe custom, but one that would echo for years. The camp in which Temujin spent his earliest days likely consisted of several jurs arranged in a loose semicircle facing south. A standard jur measured roughly 5 meters across, supported by a wooden lattice wall that could collapse inward for transport. The roof poles met at a circular crown ring about 1 meter in diameter. Felt layers pressed from sheep's wool were bound tightly against winter winds. The central hearth burned dried dung and small timber cut from nearby slopes. Smoke left a darkened stain around the crown opening. Childhood in this setting began with motion. Infants were wrapped tightly in felt-lined swaddles and placed near the hearth for warmth. By age 3 or 4, children were lifted onto sheep or small ponies to steady themselves. A steppe pony stood around 1.3 meters at the shoulder, compact and resilient. These animals grazed year-round, pouring through snow to reach grass beneath. Their endurance formed the foundation of every family's security. Yasuje's political standing depended on careful alliances. In the early 1170s, he sought to strengthen ties with neighboring clans through betrothal arrangements. According to the secret history of the Mongols, Temujin was promised to Bert of the Ongjarat, whose people lived closer to the eastern grasslands near the Onon River. Such arrangements were practical decisions meant to secure future cooperation. Bride price often included livestock, perhaps several horses and dozens of sheep, transferred between families over agreed intervals. The broader political environment remained unstable. The Tatars, residing near Lake Bure, maintained contact with Jin frontier officials in Zhongdu. In 1161 and again in later decades, Jin campaigns attempted to influence steppe leadership by granting titles and gifts. Metal cauldrons, bolts of silk, and iron-tipped spears entered the grasslands through these exchanges. Such goods altered internal hierarchies. A leader who controlled access to iron arrowheads or silk garments could command greater loyalty. Around 1171 or 1172, when Temujin was still a boy, Yasuje escorted him to the Ongjarat camp to formalize the betrothal with Bert. The journey would have followed river valleys eastward, skirting low hills and crossing streams shallow enough for mounted passage. Horses carried leather water bags and dried meat for the trip. Camps were set at dusk, near reliable water sources, tents assembled within an hour. On the return journey, Yasuje stopped among the Tatars, possibly near the Karakorum River basin. There he was recognized as a Borjigin leader who had once opposed them. Accounts state he was poisoned, likely with a substance mixed into fermented drink. Poisoning was not uncommon in steppe politics, particularly during times of truce or negotiation. Yasujay managed to ride back toward his own camp, but died soon after, around 1171 or 1172. His death shifted everything. Leadership did not automatically pass to his eldest son. Temujin was still a child. The Tayichiyad, who had previously followed Yasujay, withdrew their support. In steppe custom, loyalty flowed towards strength. Without a mature leader capable of distributing protection and wealth, followers sought other alliances. The Borjigin household was left exposed. Hurilun, now a widow with several young children, including Kasa, Hachian, Temuj, and a daughter, Temulan, faced abandonment. The family's herd was taken by departing clansmen. What remained were a few animals and basic tools, a wooden cart, leather saddles, perhaps a small number of sheep. The loss of livestock was more than economic. It signaled loss of status. The family moved toward more isolated terrain along the Onon's upper banks, where fishing and gathering could supplement dwindling supplies. Bone fish hooks, carved from animal remains, were used to catch river fish in narrow channels. Wild berries and roots were gathered in summer. In winter, they relied on small game trapped near forest edges. The climate during those years would have tested endurance. Winter winds in the Kentai region can exceed 30 kilometers per hour. Snow drifts accumulate along valley walls. Fuel sources are limited. Birch and larch wood must be cut and dried in advance. A jur without sufficient felt covering allows frost to creep along interior surfaces overnight. Breath freezes against the inner lining. Children wake to a thin layer of ice near the doorway. Temujin grew up under these conditions of scarcity. Hunger and vulnerability were constant companions. Authority, once present through his father's standing, had evaporated. The steppe did not pause to offer sympathy. Neighboring clans continued their rivalries and trade. Caravans still moved along distant routes toward the Gobi's edge. The Onon River continued its seasonal rise and fall. In this landscape of quiet endurance, Temujin's understanding of loyalty began to form, not as inherited privilege, but as something fragile, dependent on strength and fairness. The boy who had once been betrothed as a symbol of alliance now lived at the margins of tribal society. The environment did not soften him. It required awareness. It required caution, and it placed him in direct contact with the limits of the existing system, limits that would later shape his response to power. The isolation of these early years would soon give way to conflict within his own household, as scarcity sharpened tension among brothers. The steppe allowed little space for weakness, even within a single family. The years following Yasujay's death were not marked by a single dramatic crisis. They were defined instead by repetition, long winters, uncertain food, and the steady awareness that no allied clan stood ready to help. Hurilun led her children along the upper Onon River, moving camp when pasture thinned or fishing grew scarce. The river valley narrowed in places, bordered by wooded ridges where birch trunks rose pale against dark soil. In early morning, mist hung low above the water before lifting into clear blue sky. The Borjigin household was no longer protected by Tayichiyad's strength. Their former allies had redistributed livestock and attached themselves to other leaders. Without horses in large number, mobility decreased. A small herd meant limited trade. Scarcity pressed inward. Food gathering became structured work. Fish were caught using hooks carved from bone and tied with sinew thread. Small nets may have been fashioned from twisted fibers. The Onon's waters held grayling and other river fish, especially in late spring when snowmelt increased flow. Children learned to stand still along the banks, watching for ripples in shallow pools. Game supplemented the diet. Marmots and small deer were hunted when possible. Arrows used for small animals differed slightly from war arrows. Their heads were lighter, sometimes blunt to avoid damaging fur. A child's bow might measure around 70 to 80 centimeters, gradually increasing in draw weight as strength developed. Every tool had to last. Iron arrowheads were valuable and not easily replaced. Hunger did more than weaken the body, it strained relationships. Temujin had an older half-brother, Bekta, born of Yesugei's earlier marriage. In steppe custom, hierarchy among sons mattered. Bekta held seniority by age. As resources diminished, questions of authority surfaced within the small camp. Who controlled the remaining meat? Who directed hunting decisions? Who would one day claim leadership if opportunity returned? The secret history of the Mongols recounts that tension escalated when Bekta asserted control over shared provisions. Whether driven by practical necessity or personal ambition, his actions were perceived as limiting the younger brother's access to food. The household, already fragile, now contained internal rivalry. The geography around them did not shield these conflicts. The Khentii foothills provided wood and some protection from wind, but open stretches along the river offered little concealment. In such terrain, disputes could not be hidden for long. Words carried easily in the still air of evening camps. At some point during the mid-1170s, perhaps when Temujin was in his early teens, he and his brother Kassar confronted Bekta. The encounter likely occurred away from the main camp, perhaps near a low ridge or along a wooded edge where hunting parties traveled. Accounts describe Temujin shooting Bekta with an arrow. The killing was deliberate. Fratricide on the steppe was not unknown, but it carried consequences. Killing a close relative risked alienating followers and violating custom. Yet in this case, the household was already isolated. There were few external witnesses to judge the act. The removal of Bekta resolved immediate competition over authority within the small family unit. The act marked a shift in Temujin's development. It was not an impulsive child's quarrel. It reflected awareness that leadership required decisiveness. In a world where support could evaporate quickly, hesitation carried risk. Winter followed as it always did. Snow accumulated in shallow drifts across the Onon basin. The family's jur would have been reinforced with additional felt layers, perhaps tied tightly with horsehair ropes to prevent lifting by wind. Inside, dried dung fuel burned slowly in the hearth. Smoke darkened the interior wood supports over time. During these seasons, Huralun maintained discipline. Her role extended beyond survival. She reminded her sons of their lineage, of Yesugei's standing before his death. Oral memory preserved status even when material wealth disappeared. Around the hearth, stories of ancestors were retold. The name Borjigin carried weight. It linked the children to a broader network of steppe nobility, even if that network had withdrawn. Beyond their immediate camp, the larger tribal landscape continued its motion. The Teochead consolidated under new leaders. The Kerate maintained their position near the Toul River. The Nayman held roots near the Altai passes. Trade caravans moved between the Gobi's northern edge and Zhongdu. The Jin dynasty's frontier walls remained guarded. In this broader system, the Borjigin family seemed insignificant, yet isolation did not mean invisibility. Word of their vulnerability circulated. In the late 1170s, Teochead forces reportedly captured Temujin. The arrest likely occurred during a seasonal gathering or a chance encounter near the Onon's banks. Captives on the steppe were often restrained using wooden kangs, heavy wooden collars fitted around the neck to prevent escape. Such devices could weigh several kilograms and restricted movement severely. Temujin's capture reinforced his precarious position. Bound and held under guard, he would have observed the structure of Teochead camps from the perspective of a prisoner. Rows of jurs, horses tethered in groups, armed men rotating watch. The kang pressed against his shoulders. Escape required opportunity and assistance. Accounts suggest he was aided by a sympathetic guard or household member and managed to flee, possibly seeking concealment in a river channel or wooded area. The Onon's tributaries include narrow marshy sections where reeds grow thick in summer. Such terrain could provide temporary cover for a fugitive. Survival after escape demanded careful timing. Night travel reduced visibility but increased risk of losing direction. Stars served as guides. The North Star held position above the horizon, steady against the rotation of others. Knowledge of terrain, hills, tree lines, water bends, allowed orientation even in darkness. These experiences, killing a brother, enduring capture, planning escape, did not unfold as isolated events. They formed part of a continuous education shaped by the steppe's demands. Authority had to be secured. Weakness invited exploitation. Memory of status needed reinforcement through action. By the end of his adolescence, Temujin had learned that alliances were conditional. Kinship alone did not guarantee loyalty. Strength and fairness would need to coexist if he hoped to rebuild standing. The environment had offered no comfort, only instruction. Beyond the Kentai ridges, the broader political order remained unsettled. The Jin dynasty continued to engage in frontier diplomacy. Tribal rivalries sharpened. Opportunities for alignment or conflict persisted. Temujin's next steps would not be taken alone. The bonds he began to form beyond his immediate family would shape his return to the wider political field of the steppe. Escape did not restore status, it restored possibility. After fleeing Tayichid captivity in the late 1170s, Temujin returned to the upper Onon basin, where his family remained near the wooded slopes of the Kentai Mountains. The land had not changed. Birch trunks still leaned over narrow streams. Winds moved steadily across the open clearings, yet his position within it had shifted. He was no longer only a dispossessed child. He had survived imprisonment by a stronger clan. That fact carried quiet weight. The Onon River valley in early summer offers brief abundance. Grass grows thick along the banks, and fish move through calmer channels after spring thaw. Herd animals regain strength during these months. A family with even a modest number of horses can rebuild slowly. Temujin began attracting a small circle of companions, young men from minor lineages or households dissatisfied with their own leaders. Loyalty at this stage was not formal. It was personal and built on shared hardship. One of the earliest and most significant of these bonds was with Jamaka. The two are said to have sworn Anda, a blood-brother oath, sometime in their youth. Such oaths were sealed through ritual exchange and public declaration. They signaled equality and mutual defense. In a world where kinship structured alliances, chosen brotherhood carried special force. The oath likely occurred at a gathering near a river crossing or seasonal encampment, settings where multiple clans assembled for negotiation. The political environment of the 1180s remained fragmented. The Kherate under Togrul controlled regions along the Toul River and held influence across parts of central Mongolia. The Merkit occupied territories north of the Selenga River, extending toward forest steppe zones near Lake Baikal. The Nayman governed areas westward near the Altai Mountains, overseeing trade routes that connected to Central Asia. Each group measured authority in followers and herds. A leading household might command several hundred horses and control multiple subordinate families. Camps were arranged in expanding arcs. At larger assemblies, the central jur of the ruling family could be distinguished by taller roof poles and decorative felt panels stitched with dyed wool patterns. Temujin's resources were still modest, yet his lineage as a Borjigin carried residual prestige. He sought to reassert that identity through action rather than inheritance. Marriage became a turning point. When he traveled to reclaim Bert from the Ongjurat, likely in the early 1180s, he did so with limited escort. The Ongjurat lands lay east of the Onon, near the Kurlan River basin. That region features rolling grasslands broken by shallow valleys. Summer winds sweep across uninterrupted plains. Bert's return strengthened his claim to alliance, but stability remained fragile. Shortly after her arrival, Merkit forces raided Temujin's camp, capturing Bert and several household members. The raid was not random. It likely echoed the earlier abduction of Huralun by Yesujay decades before. Steppe politics preserved memory across generations. The Merkit camp was situated north of the Selenga River, an area marked by mixed forest and grassland. The Selenga flows broad and steady before emptying into Lake Baikal. Its banks support willow growth and provide access to fishing grounds. To recover Bert, Temujin required assistance beyond his immediate circle. He turned to Togrul of the Kerate, his father's former ally, and to Jamaka. Togrul's authority extended across central Mongolia, and his camp likely included hundreds of Jurs during major gatherings. Iron-tipped spears, leather armor reinforced with metal plates, and signal drums formed part of his military equipment. Cooperation with him offered legitimacy. The joint expedition against the Merkit probably occurred around 1184. Forces moved northward, crossing the Selenga and advancing into Merkit territory. Mounted warriors traveled with remount horses to maintain speed. A typical warrior might carry a composite bow, a quiver holding 30 to 60 arrows, a curved saber approximately 70 centimeters long, and a small shield made of layered leather. The attack was swift. Merkit camps were vulnerable during night hours when herds were clustered and guards reduced. Accounts suggest Bert was recovered successfully. The victory reinforced Temujin's standing among allies. It demonstrated that he could mobilize support and act decisively. Environmental conditions shaped these movements. North of the Selenga, terrain becomes uneven, with patches of forest breaking open steppe. Summer nights cool rapidly after sunset. Morning fog can settle along riverbanks, reducing visibility. Knowledge of these features gave advantage to experienced riders. Yet success introduced tension. The alliance with Jamaka began to strain. Differences in leadership style and distribution of spoils emerged. Temujin reportedly favored merit-based reward, elevating followers for loyalty rather than noble birth. Jamaka adhered more closely to traditional aristocratic hierarchy. The divergence reflected deeper structural questions within steppe society. By the late 1180s, these differences became open rivalry. Supporters chose sides. Camps separated. What began as shared hardship had grown into competing visions of authority. Temujin's return to tribal politics was no quiet reintegration. It marked the start of transformation. He had moved from exile to alliance, from vulnerability to assertion. The grasslands between the Onon and the Toul rivers now carried the weight of gathering conflict. The steppe remained wide and indifferent. Herds grazed beneath the same open sky. Rivers followed their seasonal course. But within this steady landscape, new alignments were forming, alignments that would challenge inherited patterns and begin reshaping the balance of power across eastern Mongolia. By the late 1180s, the grasslands between the Onon and Toul rivers carried more than seasonal migration. They carried division. Temujin and Jamaka, once bound as Anda, had begun to attract separate circles of followers. Their oath, sworn years earlier in youth, had symbolized equality. Now both men stood at the edge of independent authority. The tension between them did not erupt at once. It deepened gradually, shaped by expectation and pride. The steppe in early summer offered space for large encampments. Near the upper Toul River, open valleys allowed hundreds of Jurs to be arranged in concentric arcs. Horses grazed outward in widening bands, guarded by boys riding light ponies. Smoke rose in thin lines above felt roofs. The air carried the scent of mare's milk, fermenting in leather bags hung beside tent entrances. Jamaka descended from aristocratic lineage within the Jadaran clan. His supporters valued established hierarchy. In his camp, noble households likely occupied the central positions. Decorative saddle blankets, silk-trimmed deals, and bronze belt plaques marked rank. Authority flowed through inherited prestige. Temujin's camp, smaller at first, reflected a different pattern. He elevated men based on loyalty and demonstrated ability. Individuals from modest backgrounds, former servants, hunters, even men captured in earlier conflicts, were given responsibility. This shift unsettled older norms. It suggested that allegiance could outweigh birth. The divergence became visible during shared migrations. According to later accounts, a dispute emerged when Jamaka camped separately after a joint assembly, symbolically distancing himself. In steppe culture, the physical placement of tents carried political meaning. A leader who withdrew to his own encampment signaled independence. Environmental factors shaped these gatherings. The Tool River Valley provided dependable pasture, but it also concentrated rival groups into proximity. When herds grazed side by side, small disputes over water or grazing boundaries could escalate quickly. Summer storms rolled across the plains without warning. Thunder echoed against distant hills. Such instability in weather mirrored the fragile alliances below. By around 1187, open conflict became unavoidable. Supporters chose sides. Some clans, wary of Jamaka's rigid hierarchy, aligned with Temujin. Others preferred the established order. The break was not merely personal. It represented competing structures of power. Jamaka was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, by his followers during this period. The declaration likely occurred at a formal gathering in an open valley, perhaps near the upper Onon or Kerulan regions. Proclamations required public witness. Horses would have been tethered in tight rows, drums beaten to signal attention. Elders and warriors assembled in semicircles. Temujin did not yet claim such a title. His authority was still consolidating, yet he began reorganizing his followers into structured units. Instead of clustering purely by clan, he formed groups mixing different lineages. This quiet restructuring reduced the risk of collective defection. It also weakened the power of traditional aristocratic blocs. Armed conflict followed. One early engagement between their forces likely occurred near the Onon River basin. The terrain there includes open grassland broken by shallow ravines and low ridges. Mounted archers maneuvered across these contours, using elevation for advantage. A typical Mongol composite bow, measuring roughly 110 centimeters unstrung, could send arrows over 200 meters in skilled hands. Riders carried spare bowstrings tucked inside their clothing to keep them dry. Jamaka's forces reportedly defeated Temujin in this initial clash. Accounts describe severe treatment of captives, including execution methods intended to deter opposition. The defeat forced Temujin into temporary retreat. Loss did not dissolve his following. Instead, it refined his methods. He placed greater emphasis on loyalty that extended beyond noble status. He reinforced bonds with men who had stood beside him through exile and scarcity. Among them were Barorchu and Jelmi, early companions whose allegiance dated back to youth. The broader political field continued shifting. Togrul of the Kerate maintained a cautious relationship with both leaders. His territories near the Tool River and toward the Orkhon Valley gave him strategic weight. The Jin dynasty, observing events from Zhongdu, had interest in preventing steppe unification that might threaten their northern frontier. Environmental rhythms persisted regardless of human rivalry. Autumn brought cooling winds and yellowed grass. Herds were driven toward winter pasture near forested slopes. Camps tightened their arrangements, preparing for snow. War did not pause for season, but winter campaigns required careful planning. Frozen rivers allowed easier crossing, yet exposed riders to extreme cold. Temujin's early conflict with Jamaka revealed a structural question: could authority on the steppe rest on merit rather than lineage? The answer was not yet clear. His defeat demonstrated the strength of established networks, but his survival showed that alternatives had begun to take root. The grasslands remained vast and unbounded, yet within that openness, a fault line had appeared. It ran not only between two men, but between two visions of how the steppe might be governed. Conflict with Jamaka did not unfold in isolation. Every military decision on the steppe rested on family alliances, trade access, and inherited grudges. By the early 1190s, Temujin understood that survival required more than battlefield skill. It required carefully layered relationships. The Ongjurat alliance through Burt remained central. Her people occupied eastern grasslands near the Onon River, where rolling plains stretch wide before narrowing toward Lake Bure. The Onon flows steadily through low banks edged with reeds. In late summer, its water reflects the pale gold of dry grass. Camps in that region often position jurs on slightly elevated ground to avoid seasonal flooding. Marriage on the steppe was political architecture. Bert's presence connected Temujin to an established network of households. Bride wealth, often delivered in livestock, was both symbolic and practical. A transfer of perhaps several dozen sheep or multiple horses reinforced obligation between families. These exchanges were remembered. They could be invoked in times of conflict. Yet kinship alone did not guarantee stability. Temujin's reliance on Togrul, leader of the Karaite, became increasingly complex. Togrul's authority stretched across central Mongolia, with influence near the Toul River and the Orkhon Valley. His camp, when fully assembled, may have included several hundred jurs. His followers possessed iron weapons, lamellar armor composed of small plates laced together, and established trade contact with Jin frontier officials near Datong. Temujin addressed Togrul as father, reviving earlier ties formed between Togrul and Yesuje. Such language was strategic. It invoked obligation without surrendering autonomy. In steppe culture, fictive kinship, declaring someone father or brother, created binding expectation. Around 1194 or 1195, cooperation between Temujin and Togrul deepened during campaigns against the Tatars. The Tatars, positioned east near Lake Bure and along routes that connected to Jin markets, had long maintained influence. Jin forces had previously supported them as counterweight to other Mongolic tribes. Their camps included wagons reinforced with iron bands and leather-covered shields suited for mounted warfare. Campaigns against the Tatars likely unfolded across open terrain broken by shallow ridges. Riders advanced in coordinated lines, signaling through flags or horn calls. A Mongol archer could release several arrows in rapid sequence while galloping. Arrows carried iron heads shaped for penetration, some weighing between 20 and 40 grams. The defeat of Tatar groups brought redistribution of captives and livestock. Temujin reportedly adopted a policy of integrating conquered people into his own ranks rather than leaving them as separate units. This approach differed from older tribal customs, which often preserved conquered groups intact. Integration weakened rival identities and strengthened his growing network. Environmental conditions influenced these campaigns. The eastern grasslands near Lake Bure experience strong seasonal winds. In spring, dust can rise in low clouds, reducing visibility. Water sources are scattered, requiring knowledge of wells and seasonal streams. Control of such information determined mobility. As Temujin's following expanded, he formalized internal organization. Instead of clustering warriors by lineage, he grouped them in mixed units. A commander might oversee 10 men from different clans. Above him, another oversaw 100. This structure, later known as the decimal system, began in practical form during these early years. It limited the ability of entire clans to defect together. Jamaka observed these changes with concern. His supporters, many from aristocratic backgrounds, viewed the erosion of lineage privilege as destabilizing. Tension sharpened again. Around 1201, Jamaka was proclaimed Gua Khan once more by a coalition of tribes opposing Temujin. The gathering likely occurred near the upper Onon or Kerulan regions, where open plains allowed large assemblies. Horses were tethered in long rows. Leaders stood before gathered warriors, affirming allegiance through ritual and oath. The split between the two leaders had now widened into a broader political contest. Togrul, initially aligned with Temujin, faced pressure from aristocratic factions within his own Karaite confederation. Steppe politics rarely allowed simple loyalty. Alliances were measured against shifting advantage. The landscape during these years remained constant in its demands. Autumn migrations required movement toward sheltered valleys near the Kentii foothills. Snow could arrive suddenly in October. Camps were reorganized quickly, with heavier felt coverings added to jurs. Herds were counted carefully before winter. A loss of even a few dozen animals could weaken a household's standing. Temujin's authority grew not because the environment softened, but because he responded to its pressures with structure. He rewarded men who proved reliable in both raid and retreat. He punished betrayal firmly, but incorporated talent regardless of origin. Loyalty began to attach to him personally rather than to inherited clan hierarchy. These choices were not ideological, they were practical. A leader who depended only on noble birth risked fragmentation when rivals emerged. A leader who built mixed units and merit-based advancement created resilience. As the first years of the 13th century approached, alliances hardened into camps. Jamaka's supporters emphasized tradition, Temujin's following emphasized cohesion. Togrul stood between them, balancing loyalty and self-preservation. The grasslands between the Onon and Toul rivers prepared once more for confrontation. By the turn of the 13th century, rivalry between Temujin and Jamaka had moved beyond personal dispute. It now involved coalitions of tribes stretching from the Onon River westward toward the Orkhon Valley and beyond to the Altai foothills. What had begun as disagreement over status had become a contest over how the steppe itself would be organized. In 1201, Jamaka's supporters formally proclaimed him Genghis Khan during a gathering of opposing tribes. The assembly likely took place in open pastureland where large encampments could form, possibly near the upper Kerulan basin. Such gatherings required space for hundreds of mounted warriors, horses tethered in lines, and jurs arranged to reflect rank. Oaths were sworn publicly. Drums and horns signaled unity. The proclamation was not symbolic alone. It was a declaration of collective resistance. Temujin responded not with retreat, but with acceleration. Environmental conditions shaped the coming confrontations. Early summer across the central Mongolian plateau brings long daylight hours and rapid grass growth. Horses regain strength after winter. Rivers such as the Toul and Onon run full but manageable. Movement becomes easier. Campaigns often began during this period. Temujin's forces met Jamaka's coalition in a series of engagements between 1201 and 1204. One major conflict is associated with the Battle of the 13 Sides, though exact location remains debated. The terrain across central Mongolia includes shallow valleys, scattered hills, and open plains ideal for mounted maneuver. Riders could deploy in crescent formations, drawing opponents into feigned retreats before turning in coordinated attack. The composite bow remained the central weapon. Constructed from layers of birch or maple wood, backed with horn and reinforced with sinew, it was glued using animal-based adhesives that required careful drying. When strung, its recurved limbs stored tension efficiently. An experienced archer could shoot accurately from horseback at considerable range. Each warrior typically carried multiple arrow types, broadheads for flesh, narrow heads for penetrating armor. Temujin's restructuring of his followers into decimal units now proved decisive. Groups of 10 Arban, 100 Jaghun, and 1,000 Mingan allowed coordinated movement beyond clan boundaries. Orders traveled quickly through signal flags and drumbeats. Mixed composition reduced the risk of collective desertion. Jamaka's forces retained strong aristocratic leadership, but lacked the same structural integration. Internal divisions weakened cohesion during prolonged campaigns. Some of his allies defected after initial clashes, recognizing the organizational advantage Temujin had achieved. The decisive turning point came around 1204 with the defeat of the Nayman, who had aligned against Temujin. The Nayman territory lay westward near the Altai Mountains, where rolling steppe rises toward higher ridges. Rivers there cut deeper channels through grassland. Camps were often positioned near tributaries feeding into the Orkhon system. The Nayman leader, Tayang Khan, commanded a significant force. His camp likely included ornate standards and well-equipped warriors. Yet during battle, Temujin's forces broke their formation. Accounts describe confusion spreading among Nayman ranks. Tayang Khan was killed or died during retreat. His son Kuchlug fled westward. The fall of the Nayman removed one of the last major steppe powers resisting Temujin. It also extended his reach toward trade corridors connecting to Central Asia. Iron goods, silk textiles, and craftsmen captured during campaigns were integrated into his expanding domain. Environmental immersion reveals what such a victory meant in physical terms. The Altai foothills are marked by wide valleys with coarse grasses and scattered stone outcrops. In autumn, wind moves through yellowed plains beneath distant snow-capped peaks. A defeated camp leaves visible traces: trampled pasture, broken arrows, abandoned wagons with wooden wheels bound in iron rims. Following the Nayman defeat, Jamaka's support collapsed further. Betrayed by some of his own followers, he was eventually handed over to Temujin around 1206. Jamaka requested death without bloodshed, according to tradition. Whether the details are exact or shaped by later retelling, his executions symbolized the end of the old aristocratic order that had defined steppe politics for generations. The final consolidation occurred during a Kurultai in 1206 near the source of the Onon River. Leaders and representatives from conquered tribes gathered in open grassland surrounded by low wooded hills. Horses were tethered in disciplined lines. Standards bearing horsehair banners stood upright in the wind. At this assembly, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, often rendered as Genghis Khan, meaning ruler or universal sovereign. The title marked formal recognition of authority across previously divided tribes. The geography of the Onon Basin framed the moment. The river flowed steady beneath wide sky. Forested ridges of the Kentai Mountains formed distant boundaries. The land itself had not changed, but its political structure had. What emerged in 1206 was not simply dominance of one clan over others. It was the replacement of lineage-based fragmentation with a centralized, merit-based confederation. Tribes were reorganized into new administrative units. Loyalty was directed upward to the Khan rather than sideways to aristocratic families. The steppe had seen unity before, in the days of Bilge Kaghan and the Uyghur rulers at Ordubalik. Yet this unification differed in structure and intent. It did not rebuild old aristocracy, it reshaped it. The child once abandoned along the Onon River now stood acknowledged as supreme ruler of the Mongolian plateau. The transformation had unfolded gradually through exile, alliance, defeat, reform, and war. The grasslands remained vast. The wind still crossed the plains as it always had. But after 1206, movement across those plains answered to a single authority. Long before the Kurultai of 1206 formalized his authority, Temujin's wars against rival tribes had already reshaped the political map of eastern and central Mongolia. The proclamation of Genghis Khan was the outcome of more than a single victory. It rested on more than a decade of calculated consolidation across the grasslands stretching from the Kerulan River to the Altai foothills. The final years of the 12th century were marked by near-constant movement. Camps rose and folded quickly. Herds were driven across valleys in response to military need rather than seasonal rhythm alone. Rivers such as the Onon and Toul became not just lifelines, but corridors of maneuver. The campaign against the Tatars in the mid-1190s marked one of the early large-scale shifts in balance. The Tatars settled east of Lake Bure and along routes connecting to Jin frontier outposts near Dartung, had benefited from earlier Jin patronage. Their camps were positioned across open terrain dotted with low hills and shallow lakes. In spring, reeds grew thick along the lake shores. The wind carried fine sand across exposed ground. Temujin's alliance with Togrul of the Kherate allowed coordinated action against them. The assault was swift. Mounted units advanced in dispersed formation, minimizing vulnerability to concentrated resistance. Archers fired in waves before closing distance. Captured Tatar leaders were reportedly executed, and portions of the population were redistributed among loyal households. Material integration followed victory. Captured iron cauldrons, silk garments obtained through Jin trade, and herds numbering in the hundreds were absorbed into Temujin's growing confederation. Livestock was counted carefully. Horses were inspected for strength and endurance. Each animal represented mobility and military potential. The decimal organization, Aben 10, Jaghan 100, Mingan 1000, was increasingly formalized during these campaigns. Mixed composition reduced tribal cohesion as an independent force. Orders traveled through flag signals and drumbeats. A unit of 1,000 riders could pivot and redeploy rapidly across open ground. Commanders were selected for reliability rather than lineage. Environmental conditions dictated strategy. Summer offered speed, but also exposed water dependency. Wells and river crossings became strategic points. During dry spells, access to a reliable stream could determine whether a unit maintained strength or faltered. Scouts were sent ahead to assess grazing potential before large forces moved. In 1203, tension with Togrul escalated into conflict. The Kherate, long allies, now saw Temujin's rise as a threat. Togrul's camp near the Toul River had grown accustomed to primacy. His jur likely stood elevated on a slight rise, marked by decorative felt panels and guarded by trusted retainers. The clash between their forces unfolded across central Mongolia's open valleys. Accounts describe a surprise attack by Togrul's faction, forcing Temujin into temporary retreat. Night movement became critical. Retreating units relied on moonlight and familiarity with terrain. Horses were driven silently across grassland, avoiding rocky ground that might betray position. Temujin regrouped and counterattacked. The decisive engagement likely occurred near the Kerulan or Toul systems. Togrul's forces fragmented under pressure. The former ally fled and was later killed, possibly by Nayman forces unaware of his identity. The defeat of the Kherate removed a powerful intermediary between eastern tribes and western confederations. It opened the Onon Valley, an area of rich pasture and historical significance dating back to the Gurktuic inscriptions of 732 and 735. The valley's broad grasslands, bordered by gentle ridges, had long supported large encampments. Control of this region symbolized legitimacy. Following the Kherate collapse, Temujin moved westward toward the Nayman territory. The Nayman lands near the Altai Mountains were marked by slightly higher elevation and more rugged contours. Rivers cut deeper channels. In winter, snow accumulated heavily in sheltered basins. The Battle of Chakamout in 1204, associated with the defeat of Tayang Khan of the Nayman, proved decisive. Mongol forces used coordinated maneuver to break Nayman ranks. Tayang Khan was killed during retreat. His son Kuchlug fled west toward Karakorum territory in Central Asia. Material traces of these battles lingered across the landscape. Broken arrow shafts scattered in grass. Abandoned wagons with iron-rimmed wheels lay overturned. Armor plates laced with leather straps were left where their wearers had fallen. With the Nayman subdued, Temujin's authority extended from Lake Bure in the east to the Altai passes in the west. The steppe's major confederations had either been defeated or absorbed. Only remnants of resistance remained. The climate did not pause during these upheavals. Autumn winds swept through the Onon Valley. Grass turned brittle beneath hooves. Herds were reorganized under new masters. Families once loyal to rival leaders now swore allegiance to Temujin. The transformation was not merely military, it was administrative. He redistributed conquered populations into his own decimal units. Leaders who submitted were retained under supervision. Those who resisted were removed. Authority was centralized without erecting permanent stone capitals. Governance moved with the camp. By the winter of 1204–1205, the Mongolian plateau was largely unified under his control. Snow fell across the Kentai slopes. The Onon River slowed beneath ice. Camps tightened into compact circles against cold wind. The final step, formal recognition, would come in 1206, but the essential work of consolidation had already been achieved through disciplined warfare and structural reorganization. The grasslands had shifted from fragmented rivalry to centralized command. The old order of aristocratic confederations had been dismantled. What remained was the challenge of transforming conquest into lasting system. The break with Togrul in 1203 marked more than the collapse of an alliance. It marked the final fracture of the old confederation model that had shaped the central steppe for generations. The Karaite had long stood as one of the strongest tribal powers between the Toul River and the Orkhon Valley. Their defeat signaled that no rival structure remained equal to Temujin's rising authority. The Toul River Valley, where much of this struggle unfolded, lies in gently sloping grassland framed by low hills. In late spring, the river swells with snowmelt from the Kentai Range. The banks turn muddy, making heavy wagon movement difficult, yet mounted forces can navigate the terrain with relative ease. Horses trained on steppe pasture adapt to uneven ground, their hooves compact and durable. Togrul's camp had been well established. Contemporary descriptions suggest that Karaite leadership maintained formal court rituals influenced in part by contact with the Jin dynasty and Central Asian trade networks. Some Karaite elites were Nestorian Christians, and crosses have been found in later archaeological contexts associated with their territories. Religious identity, however, did not shield them from political realignment. When Togrul turned against Temujin, the confrontation was swift and destabilizing. Accounts describe a surprise assault that nearly destroyed Temujin's forces. Forced into retreat, he moved eastward under cover of night, possibly along tributaries of the Karakorum River where wooded patches offered concealment. Night travel on the steppe required precise knowledge of terrain. Stars provided orientation. The North Star remained a fixed point above the horizon. Riders moved quietly, leading horses when necessary to avoid noise. Leather armor stiffened in cold air. Breath rose visibly in the dark. Temujin reorganized his followers rapidly. The decimal structure allowed units to regroup even after sudden dispersal. Within weeks, he launched a counteroffensive. The battle that followed broke Karaite resistance. Togrul fled, reportedly killed soon after by Nayman forces who did not recognize him. With the Karaite absorbed, Temujin gained control of key pasturelands and trade corridors. The Orkhon Valley, site of earlier Turkic inscriptions from 732 and 735, now lay within his domain. This valley was more than fertile land. It held symbolic authority. The ruins of Ordubalik, capital of the Uyghur Khaganate, established in 744, still stood in partial outline, earthen ramparts and foundation traces stretching across open ground. Archaeological measurements at Kar Balgaz, believed to be part of Ordubalik, show wall thickness reaching up to 10 meters in some sections. Though centuries had passed since its abandonment in 840, the physical presence of such structures lingered. They reminded steppe rulers that centralized power had once taken material form. Temujin did not attempt to rebuild those walls. His authority remained mobile. but occupying the region aligned him with the memory of earlier Khagans. The final major obstacle lay westward, the Nayman Confederation. The Nayman territories extended toward the Altai Mountains, where elevations rise and valleys narrow. Rivers such as the Orkhon and its tributaries cut deeper channels through rockier terrain. In autumn, frost arrives earlier in these higher zones. Herd management becomes more demanding. Tayang Khan of the Nayman commanded significant manpower. His camp likely included richly decorated standards and organized guard units. Some Nayman elites used the Uyghur script for administrative records, suggesting greater exposure to written governance than many Eastern tribes. The decisive confrontation occurred in 1204, often identified with the Battle of Chakamout. The exact site remains debated, but it likely lay within central Mongolian terrain suitable for cavalry maneuver. Temujin's forces employed coordinated feigned retreats, drawing Nayman units into disorganized pursuit before turning sharply to attack. Lamella armor, small plates of iron or hardened leather laced together, protected elite warriors. Helmets reinforced with metal bands shielded heads from glancing blows. Yet armor added weight. A mounted warrior in full equipment carried bow, quiver, saber, possibly a lance, and wore protective gear that could weigh several kilograms. Tayang Khan was killed during the campaign. His son Kuchlug escaped westward toward the Karakorum realm in Central Asia. With the Nayman defeated, the last major confederation opposing Temujin had fallen. Environmental evidence of the campaign lingered. In the Altai foothills, broken wagon axles and discarded arrowheads would have marked former encampments. Herds captured during victory were redistributed. Horses were inspected, branded, and assigned to new units. By late 1204 and early 1205, resistance across the Mongolian plateau had largely collapsed. Winter settled across the steppe. Snow blanketed the Orkhon Valley. Rivers slowed beneath forming ice. Camps consolidated under new administrative order. Temujin's authority now stretched from Lake Bure in the east to the Altai passes in the west, from the forest edges near Lake Baikal southward toward the Gobi fringe. The unification was not symbolic, it was territorial and structural. The next step required formal acknowledgement from assembled leaders. That moment would arrive in 1206 near the Onon River, the same watershed where his life had begun in exile. In the spring of 1206, representatives from across the Mongolian plateau gathered near the upper reaches of the Onon River. The location carried weight. This was the same watershed where Temujin had been born around 1162, where his family had endured abandonment, and where rival clans had once hunted him as a fugitive. Now it served as the site of formal recognition. The Onon Basin in late spring is marked by renewal. Snowmelt from the Kentiai Mountains feeds the river's steady flow. Grasses push upward in soft green waves across open slopes. Birch and larch trees along the ridgelines show fresh leaves. The air remains cool in early morning, but daylight stretches long. A Kurultai required space. Jurs were arranged in deliberate order across open pasture. Leaders positioned their camps in visible alignment to signal allegiance. Horses, numbering in the thousands across the assembled confederation, were tethered in organized rows beyond the main encampment. Standards bearing horsehair banners rose upright against the sky. The structure of the assembly reflected the new political reality. Representatives from formerly independent tribes, the Kerate, Nayman, Merkit, Tartars, and smaller lineages, stood within a single gathering. Some had joined willingly. Others had been integrated after defeat, yet all were present under one authority. At this Kurultai, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of Chingiz remains debated among scholars, but in context, it signified universal or oceanic ruler. The title was not ornamental. It formalized control over a unified steppe polity extending across territories once divided by clan rivalries. The ceremony likely included ritual elements rooted in steppe tradition. Offerings were made to eternal blue heaven, Tengri, whose favor legitimized rule. Animal sacrifices may have accompanied oath declarations. Elders affirmed loyalty publicly. Such gestures were essential. Authority required visible acknowledgement. Material symbols reinforced the moment. The white standard of 9 yak tails, later associated with Mongol sovereignty, may have been displayed. Drums signaled proclamation. Leaders bowed or knelt in recognition. The open steppe served as both stage and witness. Environmental grounding framed the event quietly. The Onon flowed past the assembly, unchanged by human decision. The Kentii ridges stood in the distance. Wind moved steadily across grass, carrying the scent of damp soil and horse sweat. The setting was not monumental in stone. It was monumental in collective agreement. With the proclamation came structural reorganization. Tribes were no longer autonomous political units. They were integrated into decimal divisions, Arban, Jaghun, Mingan, and larger formations. Command positions were assigned based on loyalty and competence. Members of formerly rival clans were deliberately mixed within units to prevent concentrated rebellion. Administrative innovations followed. Trusted companions, such as Barochu and Jelmi, received high command roles. Subordinate leaders were tasked with overseeing specific regions. A communication system began forming, relay stations spaced roughly 25 to 30 miles apart, enabling mounted couriers to carry messages rapidly across distance. This was not yet the empire that would reach the Yellow River or the Oxus. It was the foundation. The Mongolian plateau, long characterized by shifting confederations, now operated under centralized authority. The significance of 1206 lies not only in military dominance, but in structural transformation. Leadership had shifted from aristocratic lineage toward merit-based loyalty. Conquered populations were incorporated rather than left intact. Administrative units transcended tribal identity. The Kurultai did not erase tension. Loyalty would continue to be tested. But for the first time since the era of the Gurktuic inscriptions carved in 732 and 735, the steppe recognized a single Khan whose authority extended broadly and systematically. As evening settled over the Onon Valley after the proclamation, fires burned outside Jers across the assembled camp. Herds grazed quietly beyond. Warriors rested near saddles and bows. The wind moved through tall grass as it had for centuries. Yet something had changed. The child once abandoned in these valleys now held acknowledged command over the tribes of Mongolia. The system that had shaped his exile had been replaced by one of his own design. Beyond the Kentii ridges, powerful states remained: the Jin dynasty to the south in Zhongdu, the Western Xia kingdom in Yinchuan, and distant realms across Central Asia. For the moment, they stood outside this gathering. But the consolidation of 1206 made expansion possible. The steppe was unified, and unified movement across open land would soon turn outward. After the Kurultai of 1206, Genghis Khan did not build a capital of stone. He did not enclose his authority within permanent walls. The steppe itself remained his center. Yet consolidation required more than loyalty and military command. It required rules that extended across distance and applied beyond kinship. The Orkhon Valley, now firmly within his control, offered wide pasture and symbolic depth. The ruins of Ordubalik, abandoned since 840, remained visible in low earthen ramparts stretching across open grassland. Measurements taken at Kar Balgaz show sections of wall nearly 10 meters thick at the base. Wind moved freely through the old foundations, grass growing between broken brick fragments. Genghis Khan did not rebuild those fortifications, but he understood their meaning. Earlier Khagans had attempted to anchor authority in fixed centers. He would anchor his in structure rather than masonry. The legal framework later known as the Yassa began to take shape during these years. It was not a single written code carved into stone tablets. It functioned as a set of decrees, preserved through memory and transmitted by trusted officials. Some provisions likely evolved over time, yet its early form aimed at maintaining discipline across a diverse confederation. One of its central principles concerned loyalty and order within the decimal system. Units of 10, 100, and 1,000 were collectively responsible for the actions of their members. Desertion in battle carried severe punishment. Theft among allied households disrupted cohesion and was treated as a serious offense. Obedience to command ensured survival across vast distances. Environmental realities influenced these laws. On the open plateau, where camps could stretch across several kilometers, enforcement required internal cohesion. A relay rider traveling from the Onon Basin to the Altai foothills might cover hundreds of kilometers in days if remount horses were available. For such communication to function, trust had to extend across regions. The YAM system, the early form of a relay network, began developing soon after unification. Stations were placed at intervals roughly 25 to 30 miles apart. Each station maintained fresh horses, water, and provisions. Saddles were stored ready for immediate exchange. A messenger arriving at full gallop could dismount and continue within minutes on a rested mount. The efficiency of this system transformed governance across mobile terrain. Material traces of such stations would have included simple wooden posts marking position, small supply shelters constructed from timber and felt, and enclosures for horses. These were not permanent cities. They were functional nodes in a growing network. Religious tolerance formed another element of Genghis Khan's policy. The confederation included shamanistic traditions centered on Tengri, as well as Nestorian Christians among the Karaite and Buddhist influences near Western Xia borders. Rather than impose uniform practice, he exempted religious leaders from certain obligations such as taxation or military service. This preserved stability among diverse groups. The climate of central Mongolia remained severe. Winters could extend from October through April. Snow depth varied but could accumulate heavily in sheltered valleys. Herds required careful distribution to avoid overgrazing limited winter pasture. The Yassa included regulations governing hunting seasons, particularly the great communal hunts known as Nurj. These hunts were not merely for food. They functioned as military exercises, encircling large tracts of land and driving animals inward in coordinated movement. Discipline during the hunt reflected discipline in battle. The integration of conquered populations required administrative oversight. Families captured from Tatar, Merkit, and Nayman territories were redistributed among existing units. Rather than remain intact as independent blocks, they were interwoven. This reduced the possibility of organized rebellion and increased reliance on central authority. Bronze seals began to circulate among appointed officials, marking orders and verifying authenticity. Leather dispatch pouches carried decrees across the steppe. The absence of a permanent capital did not prevent bureaucratic development. It required adaptation. The Orkhon Valley became an informal administrative center during certain seasons. Its broad pasture supported large gatherings. Rivers provided water access for thousands of animals. When the Khan's camp assembled there, the arrangement followed deliberate order. The central jur stood slightly elevated. Surrounding units formed concentric arcs. Guards maintained defined perimeters. The transformation after 1206 was structural rather than architectural. Authority rested on enforceable norms, swift communication, and organized distribution of resources. Genghis Khan's power now extended across territory unified by law and reinforced by mobility. The steppe's openness remained unchanged. Wind still crossed the grasslands. Snow still settled against felt-covered tents. Yet within that environment, a disciplined framework had taken hold, one capable of sustaining expansion beyond the plateau. By 1207 and 1208, the new Mongol polity was no longer defined only by conquest. It had begun to function as a governing system that moved across landscape without losing coherence. Authority traveled with the Khan's camp, yet it did not dissolve when that camp shifted pasture. The Onon Valley remained one of the primary seasonal centers. Its broad plains, watered by the Onon River and its tributaries, could sustain thousands of animals at once. In summer, grass grew dense and waist-high in some low areas. The valley floor stretched wide enough to host major assemblies without crowding herds. Snowmelt from surrounding hills ensured reliable water even in dry months. When Genghis Khan's court assembled there, it followed strict spatial organization. The central jur of the Khan stood slightly elevated, often marked by white felt coverings and guarded entrances. Surrounding it were the jurs of his senior wives and close kin. Beyond them stood the tents of commanders overseeing Mingan units. The outer arcs housed lower-ranking warriors and their families. Livestock grazed outward in layered rings, with horses kept closest for rapid mobilization. Administrative authority was delegated but carefully monitored. Trusted figures such as Barochu, Gelmi, and Subadeh rose in prominence during this period. Subadeh, in particular, would later command distant campaigns, but even in these early years, he was valued for discipline and strategic thinking. Leadership was not assigned based solely on noble birth. It followed demonstrated reliability. Written communication began to expand. After the defeat of the Nayman in 1204, scribes familiar with the Uyghur script were incorporated into Mongol administration. The Uyghur alphabet, adapted from earlier scripts, was written vertically and could record names, orders, and census information. Wooden tablets and parchment strips were used for record keeping. These materials were light enough to travel within leather cases tied to saddles. The Yassa continued to develop through decree rather than inscription. Punishments were consistent and public. Theft of livestock within the Confederation could result in severe reprisal. False reporting in military matters was treated as betrayal. Collective responsibility reinforced obedience. A unit of 10 was accountable for the actions of each member. The Yam relay network expanded steadily. Stations, spaced roughly 25 to 30 miles apart, formed chains across the plateau. Each station maintained several fresh horses, fodder supplies, and a small shelter built from timber frames covered in felt or hide. Couriers carried wooden tablets bearing the Khan's seal. A relay rider could cover nearly 200 miles in a day by changing mounts efficiently. Environmental realities shaped these systems. During winter, relay routes required careful management. Snow depth varied widely across regions. In open plains near the Karakorum River, winds could sweep snow into shallow drifts, exposing grass beneath. In forested zones near the Kentai Range, snow accumulated more deeply, slowing travel. Relay stations in such areas required additional fodder storage. Taxation in the early Mongol state differed from sedentary models. Rather than collecting grain or coin uniformly, the Khan extracted service and livestock. Conquered populations provided artisans, metalworkers, and specialized craftsmen. Blacksmiths were particularly valued. Iron arrowheads, stirrups, and saber blades required skilled forging. Portable forges, constructed from clay-lined pits and operated with leather bellows, could be set up near camps. The structure of military training evolved alongside administration. The Nerj, the great communal hunt, served dual purpose. Large groups encircled wide tracts of land, sometimes spanning several kilometers. Animals were driven inward gradually. Discipline was strict. A hunter who allowed prey to escape prematurely could be punished. These hunts rehearsed battlefield coordination and reinforced obedience. Religious policy remained pragmatic. Shamans continued to perform rituals invoking Tengri beneath open sky. Nestorian clergy among the Karaite retained freedom to practice. Buddhist influences from regions bordering Western Xia were not suppressed. Genghis Khan exempted religious leaders from certain obligations, recognizing their stabilizing role within diverse communities. Material details of daily governance reflected mobility. Bronze seals bearing inscriptions were carried by appointed officials. Leather saddlebags contained rolled parchments. Metal cauldrons used for communal meals were suspended over fires in central camp spaces. Armor and weapons were maintained meticulously. Rust could form quickly during damp seasons. The absence of stone architecture did not signal weakness. It signaled adaptation. The steppe offered no dense timber forests suitable for large permanent structures. It offered open grassland and shifting climate. Administration matched environment. By the end of the first decade after unification, the Mongol state functioned with surprising cohesion. Orders traveled rapidly. Units responded predictably. Loyalty was tied to reward and accountability rather than solely ancestry. Beyond the southern frontier, the Jin dynasty remained watchful in Zhongdu. Their rammed earth walls, some rising over 6 meters high, protected agricultural plains dense with villages. To the southwest, the Western Xia kingdom held fortified cities such as Yinchuan along the Yellow River. The steppe, once fragmented, now stood organized and disciplined. Its leadership had built a system that could move swiftly across open land. That mobility would soon be directed outward. By the early 1210s, the Mongol Confederation had stabilized internally. The years following 1206 were not quiet, but they were disciplined. Campaigns against remaining pockets of resistance in forest steppe regions north of the Selenga River and along the edges of the Gobi consolidated authority. These were not large wars like those fought against the Nayman or Karait. They were enforcement operations, swift, targeted, and administrative in purpose. The Selenga River basin, flowing northward toward Lake Baikal, marked one such frontier. The region combined open pasture with patches of forest. In late summer, the air grew damp near the water's edge. Fog settled low over the river at dawn. Fishing communities and small clans accustomed to looser alliances were integrated into the decimal structure. Their jurs were repositioned under new commanders. Hunting grounds were regulated under the Nurj system. The Mongol state's strength lay in uniformity of expectation. Every household understood its obligations: military service, relay support, livestock contribution. Collective responsibility reduced internal crime. Theft within a unit risked punishment for all 10 members of an arban. The enforcement was firm but predictable. One key structural shift during this period involved census-like accounting. Commanders began recording households and counting able-bodied warriors within each mingan. Though no surviving document from this precise moment exists, later Persian sources such as Juvini describe systematic registration practices emerging under Genghis Khan's rule. These counts were likely kept on wooden tablets inscribed in Uyghur script and stored within leather pouches. Material culture reflected growing complexity. Metal stirrups forged by captured artisans improved mounted stability. Saddles were reinforced with wooden frames and leather bindings. Bow cases, crafted from hardened hide, protected composite bows from moisture. The standard quiver held multiple arrow types, sorted by function. Environmental awareness remained constant. In winter across the Orkhon Valley, snow depth varied from shallow crust in exposed plains to knee-deep drifts near sheltered slopes. Herd rotation was carefully managed to prevent overgrazing. Relay stations stored dried meat and fodder. Horses were rotated frequently to maintain endurance. During these years, diplomatic contact with the Jin dynasty intensified. The Jin capital at Zhongdu, modern Beijing, was protected by thick rammed earth walls and watchtowers spaced at regular intervals. Frontier garrisons monitored movement north of the Great Wall. Trade continued, but tension rose. The Mongol state, now unified and ordered, required resources beyond pastoral limits. The plateau could sustain herds and warriors, but expansion promised wealth, grain, metal, textiles, on a scale not available within steppe ecology. Western Xia, centered at Yinchuan along the Yellow River, also stood within reach. The Tangut Kingdom's fortified cities were built from mud brick and rammed earth, walls several meters thick and reinforced by wooden beams. Irrigated fields supported dense populations. These were sedentary societies whose economic base differed sharply from nomadic herding. Before turning outward, Genghis Khan ensured internal command was secure. Senior sons, Jochai, Chagatai, Urgidei, and Tolui, were assigned roles within military leadership. Their responsibilities were not ceremonial. They commanded units, supervised campaigns, and gained experience necessary for succession stability. The Yam network now stretched across the plateau from Lake Bure in the east to the Altai approaches in the west. Relay riders could deliver instructions in days rather than weeks. This speed would become essential once campaigns crossed into agricultural territories where terrain and climate differed sharply from the steppe. Even the great communal hunts evolved into large-scale logistical exercises. Hundreds of riders formed vast encirclements, sometimes stretching several kilometers across open land. Timing, discipline, and obedience were tested rigorously. No animal was allowed to break formation prematurely. Violations brought punishment, reinforcing unity. The Orkhon Valley continued to serve as a seasonal center. The ruins of Ordubalik remained in view, eroded walls and foundation outlines. Grass grew over ancient brick. The memory of earlier empires lingered without being replicated in form. Genghis Khan's state did not seek to anchor itself in abandoned cities. It sought to carry its authority wherever its cavalry could ride. By 1211, the plateau stood ready. Internal rivalries had been suppressed. Administrative lines were clear. Military units were disciplined and integrated. Communication flowed swiftly. Beyond the Gobi's northern edge, Jin frontier forces watched carefully. To their south stretched agricultural plains dense, with villages and fortified towns. Grain fields near Datung and Zhongdu represented concentrated wealth unimaginable on the grasslands. The Mongol state had achieved internal order. The next phase would test whether that order could endure beyond familiar terrain. In 1211, Genghis Khan turned his attention south toward the Jin dynasty. The steppe, unified and disciplined, now faced a sedentary empire whose fortified cities and agricultural wealth stood in sharp contrast to the open grasslands of Mongolia. The frontier between them was not a single wall, but a zone of watchtowers, earthen ramparts, and guarded passes stretching across northern China. The Gobi Desert formed part of the natural divide. Its northern edge consisted of gravel plains and sparse vegetation. In summer, heat shimmered above the ground. Water sources were scattered and unreliable. Mongol forces crossed these stretches with careful planning, driving herds of remount horses and carrying dried meat and fermented mare's milk in leather containers. Mobility remained their advantage. Beyond the desert lay the Jin defensive lines. Near Datung and along the northern approaches to Zhongdu, sections of rammed earth walls rose more than 6 meters high. Timber-reinforced watchtowers stood at intervals, allowing signal fires to transmit warnings. These fortifications were not continuous like later Ming structures, but they formed layered defenses across key corridors. The Mongol invasion began in earnest in 1211, with forces advancing through passes such as the Yehuling region, an area of hills and narrow valleys north of present-day Zhangjiakou. The terrain here differed sharply from open steppe. Rocky slopes and forested ridges restricted cavalry maneuver. Jin forces attempted to block passage, relying on infantry formations supported by crossbow units. Mongol commanders adapted quickly. Instead of frontal assault against concentrated infantry, they employed feigned retreats to draw defenders into less secure positions. Archers on horseback fired rapidly while circling exposed units. Composite bows retained effectiveness even in humid conditions, provided strings were kept dry beneath clothing. Environmental contrast shaped the campaign. The grasslands north of the frontier allowed rapid advance. South of the passes, agricultural plains stretched outward, divided into cultivated fields. Irrigation channels cut straight lines across soil. Villages clustered behind earthen embankments. The density of settlement was unlike anything on the plateau. By late 1211, Mongol forces had penetrated Jin territory. Several frontier fortresses fell after brief sieges. Siegecraft, though not yet fully developed, began to evolve. Captured engineers were compelled to construct traction trebuchets, wooden frames using counterweights or manpower to launch stone projectiles. Stones weighing 20 to 50 kilograms could strike walls or disrupt defenders on parapets. The Mongol army remained fundamentally cavalry-based, but its structure allowed integration of specialists. Units assigned to siege operations were protected by mounted screens. Communication between detachments relied on signal flags and mounted couriers traveling between columns. Jin resistance was formidable. The dynasty, founded in 1115 by the Jurchen people, controlled northern China with established bureaucracy and tax systems. Zhongdu, their capital, was surrounded by high rammed earth walls reinforced with brick facings. Moats encircled major cities. Grain stores inside these walls supported long-term defense. Climate played its part. Northern China experiences hot summers and cold winters, though less extreme than the Mongolian plateau. Autumn of 1211 brought cooler air and reduced dust storms. Mongol units adjusted grazing patterns for their horses, relying increasingly on captured fodder rather than open pasture. The first phase of invasion did not aim at immediate destruction of the Jin state. It aimed at weakening its northern defenses and gathering resources. Captured livestock, grain, and metal goods were redistributed among Mongol units. Iron weapons and tools were valuable additions. The contrast between environments was striking. On the steppe, camps shifted daily if necessary. In Jin territory, fixed cities anchored authority. Stone gates, heavy wooden doors bound with iron, and watchtowers rising several meters above walls defined defensive strategy. By 1212 and 1213, Mongol raids penetrated deeper, targeting supply lines and isolated garrisons. The Yehuling campaign in particular weakened Jin frontier cohesion. Jin forces struggled to coordinate across mountainous terrain, while Mongol detachments moved with greater flexibility. Smoke from burning villages marked the advance, yet not all settlements were destroyed. Some were spared in exchange for submission and tribute. Genghis Khan's objective was not annihilation alone, it was subjugation and extraction. The steppe cavalry, once limited to intertribal warfare, now operated within agricultural landscapes dense with infrastructure. Rivers such as the Yellow River and its tributaries presented new obstacles. Bridges constructed from timber beams spanned narrower channels. Mongol units learned quickly to secure crossings before advancing. By 1214, the Jin court relocated its capital south to Kaifeng, recognizing the vulnerability of Zhongdu. This strategic withdrawal signaled weakening control over northern territories. The Mongol state, forged in the windswept valleys of the Onon and Orkhon, had crossed into a different world. Its mobility confronted walls. Its archers faced crossbows. Its administrative order now sustained campaigns beyond familiar pasture. The invasion of 1211 marked the beginning of sustained conflict that would culminate in the fall of Zhongdu in 1215. The steppe had turned outward, and the southern frontier would not remain intact for long. By 1212, the war between the Mongols and the Jin dynasty had shifted from frontier raids to sustained penetration. What had begun at mountain passes north of Datung now moved toward the agricultural heartland surrounding Zhongdu. The terrain forced adaptation. Open cavalry maneuver alone would not bring down fortified cities. Northern China's landscape contrasted sharply with the Mongolian plateau. Fields of millet and wheat stretched in rectangular plots divided by irrigation ditches. Villages were surrounded by tamped earth walls roughly 2 to 3 meters high. Larger cities rose behind massive rammed earth fortifications, some reinforced with brick facing. Watchtowers stood at regular intervals, their timber frames visible above parapets. The Mongol army began incorporating captured engineers from Jin territory. Traction trebuchets, operated by teams pulling rope lines, were constructed using heavy timber beams secured with iron fittings. These engines could launch stones weighing between 20 and 60 kilograms. The impact shattered wooden gates and disrupted defenders on wall platforms. Siege ladders reinforced with cross-bracing were also assembled. Environmental conditions shaped each campaign season. Summers in northern China were humid compared to the dry steppe. Bowstrings absorbed moisture and required careful maintenance. Mongol archers kept spare strings inside clothing to protect them from damp air. Horses grazed on harvested fields when pasture proved limited, feeding on crop stubble. In 1213, Mongol forces launched coordinated advances against multiple Jin strongholds. Some cities surrendered quickly after brief bombardment. Others resisted for weeks. Siege camps were arranged in disciplined formation beyond arrow range. Jurs were erected for commanders, while most soldiers slept in open air beside their mounts. Supply wagons carried dried meat, grain seized from villages, and metal tools for constructing siege equipment. The Yehuling region remained strategically significant. Its hills and narrow valleys had earlier served as defensive choke points. Now they functioned as supply corridors for Mongol detachments moving south. Scouts rode ahead to secure water sources and monitor Jin troop movements. Intelligence gathered through interrogation of captured officials supplemented reconnaissance. Jin resistance was not passive. Crossbow units stationed atop city walls fired heavy bolts capable of penetrating leather armor. Some crossbows required mechanical spanning devices, indicating significant draw strength. Jin infantry formations defended gates with spears and shields reinforced with iron rims. The Mongol response relied on mobility even during siege. Feigned retreats drew defenders outside walls, where cavalry encircled and cut them down. At night, small detachments infiltrated close to fortifications, seeking weak points or attempting to set wooden structures ablaze. By 1214, pressure on Zhongdu intensified. The city, located near present-day Beijing, was protected by walls rising over 10 meters in some sections, constructed from layers of compacted earth faced with brick. Moats surrounded key gates. Grain stores within the city were substantial but not inexhaustible. The Jin court, recognizing mounting danger, relocated its capital to Kaifeng further south in 1214. This decision weakened morale in Zhongdu and signaled strategic retreat, yet the city remained defended by garrison forces. Environmental immersion captures the setting. In late summer, dust rose from roads leading toward the city as Mongol cavalry advanced. The North China Plain extended flat and expansive, broken only by low hills and clusters of walled settlements. Warm air carried the scent of ripening grain. Smoke from burned outposts drifted faintly across horizon lines. Mongol forces tightened encirclement gradually. Siege works expanded. Earthen ramps were constructed to bring engines closer to walls. Protective screens made from layered hides shielded operators from incoming bolts. Engineers experimented with different projectile weights to maximize impact. The Mongol command structure allowed coordination across dispersed fronts. Subedai and other generals operated in tandem, isolating cities from reinforcement. Relay riders carried updates rapidly through the YAM network, ensuring strategic oversight remained unified. Despite structural advantages, the campaign demanded endurance. Disease spread more easily in settled regions than on open steppe. Water contamination within siege camps posed risk. Horses required careful feeding. Insufficient forage could weaken cavalry mobility. Through 1214, Zhongdu remained under pressure but did not fall immediately. Tribute negotiations occurred intermittently. The Jin court attempted to buy time through diplomatic overtures, offering goods and recognition. Genghis Khan accepted temporary agreements when advantageous, but did not withdraw long-term pressure. The war had evolved beyond raid and retreat. It was now a test of whether a steppe-based system could dismantle fortified urban power. The answer would become clear in 1215. By the winter of 1214-1215, Zhongdu stood isolated. The city's outer walls, constructed of rammed earth faced with brick, rose high above surrounding plains. In some sections, they measured more than 10 meters in height and several meters thick at the base. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter at regular intervals. Moats, fed by diverted waterways, encircled key approaches. Inside those walls lived a dense population, officials, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, sustained by granaries stocked during earlier seasons. Beyond the walls, Mongol forces tightened control over surrounding territory. Villages in the North China Plain had already been raided or subdued. Supply lines from the south were uncertain. The Jin court's relocation to Kaifeng in 1214 left Zhongdu politically exposed, even if still militarily defended. Winter conditions added strain. Northern China's cold was less severe than the Mongolian plateau, yet frost hardened ground and slowed agricultural work. Smoke from cooking fires rose into pale sky above both city and siege camps. Mongol units, accustomed to harsher climates, maintained discipline through rotating watches and careful management of fodder. Siege operations intensified in early 1215. Traction trebuchets constructed from heavy timber frames were positioned within range of the walls. Teams of operators hauled ropes in coordinated rhythm, releasing stones that arced over battlements. Projectiles weighing between 30 and 60 kilograms struck parapets and inner buildings. Siege ladders reinforced with cross-braced beams were carried forward under protective cover. Engineers also constructed mantlets, movable shields layered with hides and timber, to shield attackers from crossbow bolts. Jin defenders responded with their own engines and archers stationed atop towers. Crossbow quarrels, thick and iron-tipped, could penetrate leather armor at close range. Environmental immersion grounds the scene. The North China Plain in late winter is dry and windswept. Bare fields stretch outward, soil compacted after harvest. The sky remains pale, often hazed by dust. The city walls cast long shadows across surrounding ground. Horses tethered in Mongol camps pawed at frozen earth in search of grass. The siege was not a single-day assault. It unfolded over weeks of attrition. Fire played a role. Flaming projectiles launched from engines could ignite wooden structures within the city. Smoke rising from interior quarters signaled weakening control. Civilians crowded narrow streets behind walls originally designed for stability, not prolonged isolation. In the spring of 1215, Zhongdu fell. Accounts differ on exact sequence, but Mongol forces breached defenses and entered the city. What followed was destruction on a scale intended to signal irreversible conquest. Buildings were looted and burned. Metalwork, textiles, and coinage were seized. Skilled artisans were spared and relocated northward, integrated into Mongol administrative and military apparatus. Material traces of this destruction were recorded in later excavations. Layers of ash and burned debris have been identified in archaeological strata corresponding to early 13th century occupation. Brick fragments show signs of intense heat exposure. Such layers mark the violent end of Jin control over the northern capital. The fall of Zhongdu represented more than a military victory. It demonstrated that a confederation formed on open grassland could dismantle a fortified urban center protected by engineered defenses. It validated the integration of siegecraft into Mongol warfare. Genghis Khan did not attempt to rule Zhongdu as permanent capital. His authority remained mobile, yet the symbolic impact of its fall was profound. Jin control over northern China fractured. Tribute networks were disrupted. Wealth and manpower flowed northward into Mongol hands. Environmental contrast remained stark. Where Zhongdu's walls enclosed fixed neighborhoods, Mongol camps outside could be dismantled within hours. Where the city relied on stored grain, Mongol forces relied on herds and captured supplies. One system was rooted in soil, the other in movement. By 1215, the Mongol state had secured dominance over vast territories north of the Yellow River. The frontier that once divided steppe and sedentary empire had shifted decisively southward. The plateau that nurtured Temujin now supplied manpower and command structure for campaigns beyond traditional grazing lands. Yet the war with the Jin dynasty was not fully concluded. Southern strongholds remained under Jin authority. For the moment, however, the steppe had proven its capacity to break walls. Beyond the eastern campaigns, attention would soon turn westward, toward Central Asia, where another empire waited along the banks of the Oxus River. By 1218, the Mongol state stretched from the forests near Lake Baikal to the plains north of the Yellow River. Its internal order was firm. Its armies had adapted to siege warfare. Its relay network carried messages across thousands of kilometers. To the west lay a different kind of power, the Khwarazmian Empire. The Khwarazmian realm, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, extended across Transoxiana and into Persia. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, stood along the Oxus River, known today as the Amu Darya. These were irrigated lands shaped by canals branching from the river. Fields of wheat and orchards of apricot and pomegranate lined fertile banks. Mud brick walls enclosed urban centers whose minarets and domes rose above flat desert plains. The steppe west of Mongolia gradually transitions into the vast grasslands of Kazakhstan. Between these zones lie stretches of desert such as the Kizilkum, where summer heat can exceed 40 degrees C. Winter winds cut sharply across exposed ground. Caravans traveling the Silk Road crossed these regions carefully, stopping at wells and oasis towns spaced sometimes 30 to 50 kilometers apart. Trade had connected Mongols and Khwarazmians before war. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a caravan of merchants westward, reportedly numbering several hundred individuals and dozens of camels loaded with goods, silk, furs, and metalware. The caravan entered Khwarazmian territory at Otrar, a fortified city located near the Sadaria River. Otrar stood on slightly elevated ground above surrounding plain. Its walls, constructed of mud brick reinforced with timber beams, rose several meters high. Defensive towers punctuated the perimeter. Within its walls were narrow streets, storage warehouses, and a citadel rising above lower quarters. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, accused the Mongol merchants of espionage. Whether motivated by suspicion or political calculation, he ordered their arrest. Many were executed, goods were confiscated. The act violated diplomatic norms recognized across steppe and settled worlds. Genghis Khan responded first with envoys rather than armies. A delegation of ambassadors traveled to demand explanation and punishment of the governor responsible. Shah Muhammad chose confrontation. One envoy was killed, others were humiliated and returned. The execution of envoys was a severe breach of custom. Across Eurasian diplomatic practice, envoys were considered inviolable. The act removed space for negotiation. Environmental realities framed the coming campaign. Between Mongolia and Transoxiana lay more than 2,000 kilometers of steppe and desert. Rivers such as the Irtysh and Ili marked northern routes. The Sadaria and Amu Darya defined the agricultural core of Khwarazmian power. In 1219, Genghis Khan launched a full-scale Western expedition. Forces were divided into coordinated columns, each assigned specific routes to prevent congestion across fragile desert corridors. Scouts rode ahead to identify wells and grazing zones. Camels were incorporated alongside horses to carry additional supplies. The Karakorum Desert posed significant challenge. Sand and gravel plains offered little forage. Summer heat risked dehydration. Mongol strategy relied on speed and planning. Units traveled along river systems where possible, using the Sadaria as navigational guide. Otrar became the first target. Its walls were strong but isolated. Siege engines, constructed from timber carried or sourced locally, were assembled. Chinese engineers captured during earlier Jin campaigns likely assisted in building counterweight trebuchets capable of launching heavier stones than traction models. The siege of Otrar lasted several months, beginning in late 1219. Mud brick walls absorbed impact differently than stone. Projectiles chipped and cracked outer layers gradually. Undermining operations, digging tunnels beneath walls, may have been employed. Such tunnels required careful support using wooden beams to prevent collapse. The surrounding landscape was arid. Winter winds swept across open plain. The Sadaria flowed steadily but did not flood widely in cold season. Camps were established beyond arrow range, organized in disciplined arcs. Horses grazed sparse vegetation near riverbanks. When Otrar finally fell in 1220, Inalchuq was executed. The destruction signaled that breach of diplomatic conduct would be met with total reprisal. Yet Otrar was only the beginning. The Khwarazmian Empire's core cities, Bukhara and Samarkand, lay deeper within Transoxiana. They were larger, wealthier, and more heavily defended. The steppe confederation that had broken Zhongdu now advanced towards some of the most prosperous urban centers of Central Asia. The war would test whether Mongol organization could sustain operations across unfamiliar climate, fortified cities, and extended supply lines. After the fall of Otrar in early 1220, Mongol forces did not pause. Instead of advancing along a single predictable route, Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple columns, moving across the Sadaria basin with calculated unpredictability. The Khwarazmian Shah Muhammad II struggled to determine where the main blow would fall. Transoxiana in spring presents a different landscape from the Mongolian plateau. The land between the Sadaria and Amu Darya rivers is fed by irrigation canals branching from these great waterways. Wheat fields stretch in measured rows. Mud brick villages cluster near canals lined with reeds. The soil, enriched by river silt, supports dense settlement. Yet beyond irrigated zones lies arid plain, broken by scrub and shifting sand. Genghis Khan executed a maneuver that stunned Khwarazmian defenders. Rather than follow the river roads directly, he led a portion of his force across the Karakorum Desert toward Bukhara. The desert crossing was hazardous. Daytime temperatures could rise sharply even in early spring, while nights dropped near freezing. Wells were scattered and sometimes unreliable. Mongol units carried water skins made from animal hide and relied on camels to transport additional supplies. The approach from the desert allowed Mongol forces to appear unexpectedly at Bukhara's gates in February or March 1220. The city, surrounded by mud brick walls reinforced with towers, had not anticipated attack from that direction. Its citadel rose above lower quarters, and mosques and madrasas stood within narrow streets. Siege operations began quickly. Chinese and Central Asian engineers constructed trebuchets capable of hurling heavy stones. Wooden siege towers were assembled to approach walls at height. Archers provided covering fire. The Mongol army's organization into decimal units ensured coordinated pressure across multiple points. Environmental immersion frames the moment. Spring winds moved dust through the outskirts of Bukhara. Irrigation canals ran cold from snowmelt in distant mountains. Beyond cultivated fields lay open desert, pale and expansive under wide sky. Smoke from siege engines mingled with cooking fires in Mongol camps arranged in disciplined formation outside the walls. After brief resistance, parts of Bukhara surrendered. The citadel held out longer but eventually fell. The city was looted, though artisans and skilled craftsmen were often spared and reassigned. The Great Mosque of Bukhara, constructed of brick and timber beams, survived but was reportedly used temporarily as a gathering point for Mongol forces. From Bukhara, attention turned to Samarkand, one of the grandest cities of the region. Samarkand lay further east along the Zeravshan River valley. Its walls were substantial, reinforced by towers and protected by a deep moat in places. The city's population included Persian administrators, Turkic soldiers, and garrison troops numbering in the tens of thousands. Shah Muhammad had placed heavy forces there, believing its defenses sufficient. Yet Mongol strategy relied on coordinated encirclement and psychological pressure. Units under generals such as Subadeh and Jeeb approached from different directions, cutting off reinforcement and escape routes. Siege engines were again deployed. Counterweight trebuchets, possibly introduced through Chinese expertise, hurled larger stones capable of damaging towers. Sappers dug beneath walls, supporting tunnels with timber beams before setting them aflame to collapse sections. Samarkand's defenders attempted sorties, but Mongol cavalry intercepted them in open ground. The decimal organization ensured flexibility. Feigned retreats drew defenders into exposed positions. Archers on horseback maintained relentless pressure. Environmental contrast remained striking. The Zeravshan Valley's orchards and gardens contrasted with surrounding desert. Irrigation channels crisscrossed fields in precise lines. When siege damage disrupted these systems, water flow faltered, compounding hardship within the city. By March 1220, Samarkand fell. Large portions of its garrison were executed. Skilled artisans were deported eastward. Metalworkers, weavers, and engineers were incorporated into Mongol administration and military production. The fall of Bukhara and Samarkand shattered the Khwarazmian Empire's core. Shah Muhammad fled westward toward the Caspian Sea, pursued by Mongol detachments across Iran's northern plateau. Material traces of the sieges remained visible for years. Burn layers in urban strata, broken brickwork, collapsed sections of wall, these physical remnants marked transition of power. Coin hoards buried during the crisis attest to residents' attempts to preserve wealth. The Mongol state, formed on the windswept plains of Mongolia, had now captured some of Central Asia's most established urban centers. The campaign demonstrated logistical reach across desert terrain and capacity to dismantle fortified cities through combined mobility and engineering. Yet the war was not over. Further west lay Urgench, capital of Khwarazmian administration along the lower Amu Darya, and beyond that the Caucasus Mountains and the open steppe north of the Black Sea. The Mongol advance continued. After the fall of Samarkand in 1220, the Mongol campaign moved toward one of the most difficult targets in the Khwarazmian world, Urgench. Urgench lay near the lower course of the Amu Darya, close to where its waters divided into multiple channels before entering the Aral Sea basin. The region was unlike the open plains around Bukhara. Here, irrigation canals branched across flat delta land. Marshy ground alternated with cultivated fields. The soil, enriched by river deposits, supported dense settlement. Mud brick houses stood closely packed along narrow lanes. Defensive walls, reinforced with towers, enclosed the urban center. The geography made direct assault complicated. The Amu Darya shifted course unpredictably over decades, creating islands and unstable ground. Siege engines required firm foundations. Cavalry maneuver was restricted by canals and soft soil. This was not open steppe. Genghis Khan divided command among his sons, Jochai, Chagatai, and Urgidei, assigning them responsibility for the siege. Coordination was strained. The marshy terrain demanded adaptation. Timber for siege construction had to be sourced carefully, sometimes transporting from distant stands of trees. Counterweight trebuchets were assembled to batter sections of wall. Sappers dug trenches toward vulnerable points. Environmental immersion reveals the setting. The Amu Darya flowed broad and cold from mountain sources far to the southeast. Spring floods could inundate low fields. Reeds grew tall along canal banks. In summer, heat rose from damp soil, carrying insects in dense swarms. Horses required careful management to avoid injury in soft ground. Resistance at Urgench was fierce. The city's population understood the consequences of defeat. Street fighting followed breaches in the walls. Narrow alleys limited the effectiveness of mounted archers. Combat shifted to close quarters. Sabers, spears, and short bows replaced wide maneuver tactics. The siege extended into 1221. Accounts describe heavy destruction once Mongol forces gained full control. As in previous cities, skilled artisans were selected for relocation. Metalworkers capable of forging iron tools and weapons were particularly valued. Textile craftsmen and scribes were also absorbed into Mongol administration. The fall of Urgench marked the effective collapse of Khwarazmian state structure. Shah Muhammad had already fled westward, eventually dying on an island in the Caspian Sea in late 1220 or early 1221. His son Jalal ad-Din attempted resistance in Persia and Afghanistan, but the empire's cohesion had dissolved. Rather than halt at the Amu Darya, Mongol forces pushed further. Generals G bin Subadeh led detachments westward through northern Iran and into the Caucasus. This was reconnaissance as much as conquest. They crossed mountain passes near Debent, where narrow corridors between the Caucasus Mountains and the Caspian Sea formed natural choke points. The Debent Pass, fortified since Sasanian times with stone walls, had long controlled movement between steppe and south. The Caucasus presented a different environment entirely. Snow-capped peaks rose sharply above narrow valleys. Forested slopes replaced open plains. Rivers cut deep gorges. Travel required navigating steep passes where only limited numbers of riders could move at once. Mongol detachments moved north of the mountains into the steppe regions bordering the Black Sea. In 1223, they encountered forces of the Kievan Rus and their Cumans allies at the Kalka River. The Kalka, flowing through open grassland near the Sea of Azov, became the site of a significant engagement. Mongol commanders used feigned retreat once more, drawing Rus forces into overextended pursuit before encircling them. The Kalka River region in late spring is broad and grassy, with low rolling hills and scattered tree lines near watercourses. The soil is dark and fertile. Wind moves steadily across open ground. There, thousands of kilometers from the Onon River, Mongol cavalry demonstrated that their organizational structure functioned even at extreme distance. After the victory at Kalka in 1223, G bin Subadeh did not attempt permanent occupation of Rus' lands. Instead, they returned eastward, having gathered intelligence on terrain, political divisions, and potential future routes. The Western campaign from 1219 to 1221 had expanded Mongol reach from Mongolia to the edges of Eastern Europe. Cities along the Oxus and beyond had fallen. Trade networks across Central Asia were disrupted and reoriented. Yet Genghis Khan himself did not remain indefinitely in Transoxiana. After consolidating control and redistributing artisans and captives, he turned attention back toward unfinished matters in the east, specifically the Western Xia kingdom. The war in Central Asia had proven that the Mongol system, rooted in steppe mobility, reinforced by siege adaptation, governed by disciplined structure, could operate across deserts, river valleys, and mountain passes. The horizon had widened. The steppe confederation was no longer regional. It had become a transcontinental force. By 1221, while Urgench still smoldered along the Amu Darya, Mongol forces under the generals Genghis Khan were already moving westward beyond the former boundaries of the Khwarazmian Empire. Their objective was not simple occupation. It was reconnaissance in force, mapping routes, testing resistance, and measuring the political terrain of lands rarely entered by steppe armies from the east. The Caucasus Mountains rose before them as a natural barrier between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. Snow remained on high peaks well into late spring. Narrow valleys cut through ridges, and rivers such as the Kura and Terek flowed swiftly from mountain sources. The Debent Pass, positioned between the eastern Caucasus slopes and the Caspian shoreline, formed one of the few reliable corridors for large movement. Stone fortifications, they dated back to Sasanian construction centuries earlier. Defensive walls extended from mountain to sea, built of dressed stone blocks fitted tightly together. Environmental immersion captures the contrast. The steppe riders who had crossed open deserts now advanced along mountain paths where cliffs narrowed movement to single-file columns. Pine forests covered slopes, mist lingered in valleys at dawn. Snowmelt swelled rivers, making crossings unpredictable. Genghis Khan navigated these routes through negotiation as much as force. Local rulers in the Caucasus, including Georgian and Armenian princes, faced sudden arrival of mounted columns unfamiliar in language and custom. Some offered passage, others resisted and were defeated in quick engagements. The Mongol military structure proved adaptable. Decimal units could detach into smaller formations suited for mountain maneuver. Light cavalry rode ahead as scouts, while heavier units secured supply animals behind. Horses were carefully managed. Mountain forage differed from steppe grass, and steep terrain risked injury. By late 1221, Mongol detachments emerged north of the Caucasus into the open plains beyond. There, the environment shifted again. The steppe north of the Black Sea, stretching toward the Don and Dnieper rivers, resembled familiar Mongolian grasslands in its openness, though climate was milder. Winters were cold, but shorter. Rivers cut broader channels through fertile soil. These northern steppes were inhabited by Cumans, also known as Kipchaks, Turkic nomads, whose lifestyle paralleled Mongol pastoralism. Their camps were arranged in mobile formations, jurs set across open ground, herds grazing outward in arcs. Political structure was confederated rather than centralized. Initial encounters between Mongols and Cumans were hostile. Cumans sought alliance with neighboring powers, including the Kievan Rus, a federation of principalities centered around cities such as Kiev and Chernihiv. Stone churches with wooden roofs rose within walled settlements along the Dnieper River. Timber palisades protected urban centers. Trade routes connected the region to Byzantium through the Black Sea. The Mongol advance into these lands was not yet a full invasion. It was exploratory but forceful. In 1222, Mongol units defeated combined Caucasian and Cuman forces near the foothills of the Caucasus. Engagements relied on familiar tactics: feigned retreat, rapid encirclement, concentrated arrow fire from horseback. Environmental grounding reinforces the setting. The plains north of the mountains roll gently toward the Sea of Azov. Grass grows thick in spring, and wildflowers scatter across open fields. The horizon stretches uninterrupted, ideal for mounted warfare. Wind moves steadily, carrying dust raised by thousands of hooves. Genghis Khan pressed further north and west, drawing Cuman forces into retreat toward Rus' territories. Messages traveled quickly among Rus' princes, who assembled a coalition to meet the new threat. This coalition included forces from Kiev, Galicia, and other principalities. The Mongols did not establish permanent garrisons in these lands. Their objective was to understand political fragmentation and terrain. Intelligence gathered during this reconnaissance would shape future campaigns decades later. The movement from the Amu Darya through the Caucasus to the Pontic steppe demonstrated the range of Mongol command. Units operated thousands of kilometers from Mongolia, yet maintained coordination. Relay riders no longer relied on established yam stations. Instead, they adapted to local terrain and allied guides. By 1223, this westward sweep would culminate in confrontation at the Khalkha River, a battle fought far from the Onon and Orkhon valleys where the Mongol state had begun. In the spring of 1223, Mongol forces under Jib and Subadeh advanced across the open plains north of the Black Sea, drawing the attention of a coalition formed by the Cumans and several Rus' princes. The confrontation would unfold near the Khalkha River, a modest watercourse flowing toward the Sea of Azov through wide grassland. The region around the Khalkha is marked by low rolling hills and broad steppe vegetation. In late May, grass grows thick and green. The soil is dark and fertile, suitable for both grazing and cultivation in nearby settled areas. The river itself is not wide, shallow in places, edged by reeds and gentle banks, but it provided a natural reference point in otherwise open terrain. The Rus' coalition included forces from Kiev, Galicia, Smolensk, and other principalities. Their armies combined heavy cavalry, infantry, and archers. Many wore chainmail or lamella armor, iron helmets with nasal guards, and carried long spears and shields reinforced with metal rims. Timber wagons accompanied them, forming temporary defensive circles when encamped. The Mongol commanders used a strategy already proven across the steppe. They advanced in visible formation before withdrawing deliberately, maintaining cohesion while appearing disorganized. This feigned retreat extended over several days. Rus' and Cuman forces pursued, believing Mongol lines were collapsing. Environmental immersion sharpens the scene. The steppe wind moved steadily across open ground. Dust rose behind retreating cavalry. Sunlight reflected off iron helmets and spearheads. Horses churned through thick spring grass. The Khalkha River shimmered in distance under clear sky. On May 31, 1223, near the river's banks, Mongol forces executed their counterstroke. Units that had retreated pivoted sharply, reinforced by concealed detachments positioned along flanking ridges. Mounted archers circled exposed Rus' formations, releasing volleys in rapid sequence. The composite bow, though smaller than some European longbows, delivered powerful shots capable of piercing armor at close range. The Rus' coalition lacked unified command. Princes led their own contingents independently. Coordination faltered under sudden encirclement. Infantry struggled to maintain formation in open terrain without fixed defenses. Mongol units targeted isolated groups methodically. The battle lasted several hours. Casualties mounted among Rus' ranks. Some princes were captured, others fled. According to later chronicles, captured leaders were executed beneath wooden planks weighted by feasting Mongol commanders, a symbolic assertion of dominance, though accounts vary in detail. Material traces of the battle would have included broken spear shafts, discarded shields, and arrowheads scattered across grassland. Archaeological identification of the exact site remains debated, but the scale of engagement is recorded in multiple medieval sources. After the victory, Mongol forces did not attempt to occupy Kiev or major Rus' cities permanently. Their objective remained reconnaissance and demonstration of strength. They withdrew eastward across the steppe, retracing routes toward the lower Volga and eventually returning towards Central Asia. The Khalkha campaign revealed several critical realities. First, the Mongol military system functioned effectively even thousands of kilometers from its base. Second, the political fragmentation among Rus' principalities presented vulnerability. Third, the open plains north of the Black Sea resembled Mongolian steppe in ways that favored cavalry maneuver. Environmental familiarity mattered. The windswept grasslands stretching toward the Don River offered conditions not unlike those near the Onon Basin: broad visibility, mobile grazing, and open engagement space. The Mongols recognized terrain where their structure excelled. The reconnaissance in force from 1221 to 1223 extended Mongol knowledge of Eurasia dramatically. From the Amu Darya to the Khalkha River, they had crossed deserts, mountain passes, irrigated valleys, and foreign steppes. Intelligence gathered during these campaigns would inform later expansions under Urgide and Batu. When Jib and Sube'etei turned back east, they carried more than spoils. They carried mapped memory of routes, alliances, and weaknesses. The western horizon had been tested. The Mongol state now understood that beyond Central Asia lay lands divided and expansive. Genghis Khan himself, meanwhile, prepared for one final campaign in the east. After the victory at the Khalkha River in May 1223, Jib and Sube'etei did not press deeper into Rus' territory. Their mission had never been full conquest. It had been reconnaissance in force, probing alliances, mapping terrain, and testing how far Mongol organization could stretch. The withdrawal eastward was not a simple retracing of steppes. It required careful management of distance, climate, and remaining resistance. From the Khalkha Basin, Mongol detachments moved back across the Pontic steppe toward the lower Volga River. The region between the Don and Volga rivers is open grassland, broken by shallow ravines and scattered tree lines along watercourses. In summer, the grass can reach knee-height. In winter, snow lies thinner than in Mongolia, but still cuts sharply across open ground. Environmental immersion reveals the rhythm of the march. The sky over the western steppe stretches wide and pale. Wind moves constantly, flattening grass in waves. Herd animals graze in long lines, guarded by mounted scouts riding low against the horizon. Camps are set near rivers, jurs raised in ordered arcs as they had been along the Onon years earlier. Jib died sometime during this long return, possibly in 1224, though details remain uncertain. Sube'etei continued command, guiding forces eastward across Kazakhstan's grasslands. These territories resembled familiar Mongol terrain more than the irrigated fields of Transoxiana or the orchards of the Zeravshan Valley. The continuity of landscape eased movement. Horses regained strength, grazing broad pasture. The return route likely followed river systems such as the Ural and Irtysh, where water and forage were more predictable. Relay riders could not depend on established yam stations so far from Mongol administrative centers. Instead, mobile command and disciplined unit cohesion maintained order. This western expedition had covered extraordinary distance, more than 5,000 kilometers from the Onon Basin to the Black Sea steppe and back. Few armies of the era had traversed such breadth while maintaining cohesion. The decimal organization, collective responsibility, and disciplined command structure made it possible. While Sube'etei and his columns moved east, Genghis Khan had already turned attention toward unfinished matters in northern China and the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia. The Western Xia state, centered at Yinchuan along the Yellow River, had earlier submitted but resisted further Mongol demands during the Khwarazmian campaign. Its fortified cities, built of thick mud brick walls reinforced with timber, remained intact. Environmental contrast again framed the next objective. The Ningxia region around Yinchuan lies between the Ordos Desert and the Helan Mountains. The Yellow River curves through irrigated fields fed by canals. Summers are hot and dry. Winters are cold but less severe than the Mongolian plateau. By 1224, Mongol forces from various fronts converged back towards central authority. The state that had begun as a confederation along the Onon River now operated across Eurasia. Its commanders possessed first-hand knowledge of desert routes, mountain passes, and fertile plains thousands of kilometers apart. The return across the steppe did not diminish momentum. It consolidated experience. Intelligence gathered in the Caucasus and Rus lands would remain in memory for future campaigns under Genghis Khan in the 1230s. As Mongol columns reassembled closer to home territories, the political horizon shifted once more. The steppe was unified. Northern China was weakened. Central Asia had fallen. The Western reconnaissance had revealed distant vulnerabilities. One final campaign awaited Genghis Khan himself. The grasslands that had shaped his childhood would witness his last movement toward war. In 1226, when Genghis Khan was in his mid-60s, he turned south once more toward the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia. The state, centered at Yinchuan along the Yellow River in present-day Ningxia, had earlier submitted to Mongol authority during campaigns against the Jin. Yet during the long war in Central Asia, Western Xia had failed to provide the military support Genghis Khan demanded. In the logic of steppe politics, hesitation signaled unreliability. The geography of Western Xia differed sharply from the Mongolian plateau. The Yellow River curved through a broad irrigated plain bordered by the Helan Mountains to the west and the Ordos Desert to the east. Canals carried river water into cultivated fields. Mud brick cities rose from otherwise dry terrain. Summers brought intense heat. Winters were cold, but shorter than those in the Khentai Mountains. Mongol forces advanced in coordinated columns across the northern edge of the Gobi and along routes skirting desert margins. Camels once again supplemented horses for carrying supplies. Wells were mapped carefully. Scouts rode ahead to secure crossings of the Yellow River's tributaries. Environmental immersion reveals the setting. The Ningxia Plain in late summer appears as a patchwork of green irrigation lines against pale desert backdrop. The Helan Mountains rise abruptly, their rocky slopes catching evening light. Dust moves across open ground where irrigation does not reach. The air is dry and carries little scent of forest. Western Xia's fortified towns were constructed primarily of tamped earth and mud brick, reinforced with wooden beams. Walls in major cities, such as Yinchuan, could reach several meters in thickness. Watchtowers overlooked flat approaches, providing clear fields of view. Defensive gates were protected by heavy wooden doors bound in iron. Genghis Khan's campaign moved methodically. Rather than strike only at Yinchuan immediately, Mongol forces targeted secondary cities first, isolating the capital. Siege engines, counterweight trebuchets and traction models were deployed as they had been at Zhongdu and Samarkand. Engineers built ramps of packed earth to approach walls. The Tangut military included infantry units trained in crossbow use, as well as cavalry. Their armor differed from steppe lamella styles, incorporating heavier protective plates suited to defensive warfare. Yet mobility remained Mongol advantage. Cavalry units cut off reinforcement routes and intercepted messengers attempting to escape. Throughout 1226, the campaign advanced deeper into Western Xia territory. Towns such as Wuwei and Lingzhou fell in succession. Each surrender or breach tightened pressure on Yinchuan. Environmental challenges shaped the pace. Summer heat across the Ningxia Plain could exceed 35 degrees C. Horses required frequent watering. Irrigation canals sometimes became contested zones, their embankments offering limited cover. Dust storms rose suddenly from desert edges, reducing visibility. The Mongol army, seasoned by years of campaigning from the Onon to the Amu Darya, moved with confidence. The decimal system maintained discipline. Relay communication allowed coordination, across dispersed columns. Yet this campaign differed from earlier ones in one respect. It was personal. Western Xia's failure to honor alliance during the Khwarazmian War had been taken as insult. Genghis Khan intended decisive punishment. By early 1227, Mongol forces had encircled Yinchuan. The capital stood defended by thick earthen walls and supported by Yellow River irrigation networks. Inside, Tangut officials prepared for prolonged resistance. Genghis Khan himself remained with the army during this campaign, despite age and accumulated strain of decades at war. The plateau child who had once fished along the Onon River now stood before one final fortified city. The siege of Yinchuan would not only conclude the campaign, it would coincide with the end of his life. By early 1227, Yinchuan stood isolated. The city lay along the Yellow River's western bank, protected by a network of irrigation canals that both sustained agriculture and complicated assault. Its walls, built of rammed earth reinforced with timber and faced in places with brick, rose several meters high and were thick enough to absorb repeated impact from siege engines. Defensive towers projected at intervals, allowing crossbowmen to fire along the wall's length. Beyond the city stretched the Ningxia Plain, a broad expanse of cultivated fields interrupted by dry patches where irrigation failed. The Helan Mountains loomed to the west, their ridges casting long shadows across desert margins. In late winter and early spring, winds swept across open ground, lifting dust into pale sky. Mongol forces completed encirclement, positioning camps beyond arrow range, but close enough to maintain pressure. Jurs were arranged in disciplined arcs. Horses were tethered in ordered lines near canal banks where forage could still be found. Siege engines stood on reinforced platforms built from packed earth and timber beams. Counterweight trebuchets, improved through earlier campaigns in Jin and Khwarazmian territories, hurled heavy stones against Yinchuan's walls. Stones weighing 50 kilograms or more struck parapets, chipping brick facing and loosening compacted earth beneath. Sappers worked at night to undermine sections of wall, bracing tunnels with wooden supports before setting them aflame to collapse defensive structures. Environmental immersion deepens the scene. The Yellow River flowed cold and wide, its surface reflecting pale winter light. Frost clung to irrigation channels in early morning. Smoke rose from both Mongol camps and city hearths. The air was dry, carrying fine sand from nearby desert. Within Yinchuan, supplies dwindled. Grain stored in warehouses was rationed. Civilians crowded narrow streets, their mud brick homes pressed tightly together. Wells inside the city provided water, but morale declined as outer defenses weakened. Genghis Khan remained with his army during the siege. He was now in his mid-60s, a significant age for a steppe warrior accustomed to lifelong campaigning. The exact details of his health during this period remain debated. Some sources suggest he sustained injuries during a hunting accident, others imply illness. Contemporary records are sparse. What is clear is that he did not withdraw from command. Orders continued to flow through the Yam network. Generals such as Subadeh and Tolui oversaw tactical operations. His sons, Jochai having died earlier in 1225, Chagatai and Urjadeh present in leadership roles, maintained positions of authority. By mid-1227, the city's defenses were critically weakened. Portions of wall had collapsed under repeated bombardment. Mongol units prepared for final assault. The broader political landscape framed this moment. The Jin dynasty remained weakened but not fully destroyed in the south. Central Asia lay subdued under Mongol governors. Western reconnaissance had expanded knowledge of distant territories. The Mongol state had grown beyond its original plateau. Environmental continuity contrasts with political change. The Onon River valley, where Temujin had been born, lay far to the north. Yet the same wind moved across grasslands and deserts alike. The same structure of decimal organization governed armies now encamped along the Yellow River. As Yinchuan prepared to fall, the campaign that had begun in retaliation for broken alliance approached conclusion. Genghis Khan's final days would coincide with this last act of enforcement. In August 1227, while the siege of Yinchuan neared its end, Genghis Khan died. The precise cause remains uncertain. Later chronicles written in Persian and Chinese sources offer differing accounts, some suggesting illness, others injury sustained during a fall from a horse while hunting wild onagers across the Ningxia plain. Contemporary Mongol records are silent on detail. What can be established is the timing. His death occurred during the final phase of the Western Xia campaign, before or just as Yinchuan fell. The Ningxia landscape in late summer is dry and sunlit. The Yellow River moves steadily through irrigated channels. Heat rises from open ground where crops have been harvested. The Helan Mountains stand immobile against pale sky. In such terrain, the leader who had crossed deserts and mountains thousands of kilometers from his birthplace reached the end of his life. His death was not immediately announced. According to later accounts, the Mongol leadership concealed it until Western Xia was fully subdued. Yinchuan surrendered shortly thereafter. Tangut elites were executed, and the kingdom was dismantled. Administrative personnel and skilled artisans were incorporated into Mongol structures, as had been done in Bukhara and Zhongdu. Material evidence of the siege has been identified in archaeological layers around Yinchuan, burned brick, collapsed wall sections, and remnants of early 13th century destruction. Yet the location of Genghis Khan's burial remains unknown. Mongol burial customs for elites emphasized secrecy. The traditional homeland near the Kentiai Mountains, particularly around Burkhan Khaldun, holds strong association with his lineage. Burkhan Khaldun rises above forested slopes northeast of the Onon River. Its elevations exceed 2,000 meters. Streams descend from its ridges into narrow valleys. Birch and larch forests cover its flanks. Accounts suggest that his body was transporting northward, possibly escorted by a guarded funeral procession across steppe routes familiar from earlier campaigns. The distance from Ningxia to the Kentiai region spans more than 1,500 kilometers. Relay stations along established routes would have supported such movement, though secrecy likely required deviation from main paths. Traditional descriptions claim that those who encountered the funeral party were killed to preserve burial location. Whether literal or symbolic, the narrative reflects intent. His grave was not meant to become a site of political contest or monument. No confirmed tomb has been identified. Archaeological surveys in the Kentiai region have uncovered burial mounds and stone enclosures dating to earlier periods, some measuring over 10 meters in diameter and several meters high. Yet none can be conclusively tied to him. The Mongol preference for unmarked grave complicates identification. Environmental immersion returns the story to its beginning. The Kentiai Mountains in autumn are cool and quiet. Wind moves through tall grass. The Onon River flows steadily between wooded banks. Snow arrives early at higher elevations. It is within this landscape, close to where he had once hunted and hidden as a youth, that he was likely laid to rest. At the time of his death, the Mongol state stretched from the Pacific coast of northern China to the Caspian Sea. It encompassed deserts, irrigated river valleys, mountain passes, and endless steppe. Its structure rested on disciplined units, relay communication, and merit-based command. Succession passed to Urgide, selected earlier at a Kurultai as heir. The transition occurred without immediate fragmentation, a testament to institutional stability built over 2 decades. Genghis Khan's life had followed the arc of the steppe itself, born into fragmentation, hardened by exile, unified through discipline, expanded across horizons. His death did not halt expansion, it marked transition. The grasslands continued under wide sky. Herds grazed along the Onon and Onon rivers as they had for generations. Yet the political structure that governed them had permanently changed. The final chapter now turns to the legacy of that change, how institutions formed on open pasture reshaped Eurasian history long after the man himself was gone. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, authority passed to his third son, Urgide. The transition had been prepared in advance at a Kurultai, where succession was discussed while the founder still lived. That preparation reduced immediate instability. The structure he built, decimal organization, collective responsibility, relay communication, proved durable enough to survive the loss of its architect. One of the first visible shifts under Urgide was the establishment of a more defined imperial center in the Onon Valley. Around 1235, construction began at Karakorum, near the site of earlier Uyghur capital remains at Ordubalik. The valley's geography made it suitable. The Onon River flowed steadily through wide pastureland, and low ridges offered natural windbreaks. The location sat roughly 360 kilometers west of the Onon Basin, where Genghis Khan had been proclaimed in 1206. Karakorum did not resemble Chinese capitals or Persian cities in scale, yet it marked a structural shift. Archaeological excavations have uncovered remnants of mud brick walls, palace foundations, and workshops. The city's perimeter likely measured about 1.5 to 2 kilometers across in its developed form. Timber beams reinforced major structures. Chinese artisans contributed ceramic roof tiles. Metalworkers forged tools and weapon fittings within designated quarters. Environmental immersion frames this transformation. The Onon Valley in summer is bright and expansive. Grasslands stretch outward beneath open sky. The river curves gently past low embankments. Herds graze beyond the city's edges, reminding visitors that this was still a steppe capital, urban in structure, pastoral in context. Under Urgide, the Yam relay network expanded further, linking Karakorum to China, Central Asia, and eventually to the Volga region. Relay stations continued to be spaced roughly 25 to 30 miles apart. Each maintained fresh horses and provisions. Marco Polo, writing later in the 13th century, would describe this network's efficiency, though its foundations lay in Genghis Khan's early administration. Coinage and taxation systems evolved as well. In conquered Chinese territories, paper currency experiments expanded under Mongol oversight. In Persian regions, silver dirhams bearing inscriptions circulated under new administrative arrangements. Governance adapted to regional practices rather than imposing uniformity. The legacy of Genghis Khan's structure became visible in expansion beyond his lifetime. In 1236, Batu Khan and Subadeh launched campaigns into the Volga region and Eastern Europe, drawing on intelligence gathered during the 1223 Khalkha expedition. Cities such as Ryazan and Kiev fell in the 1240s. The open steppe north of the Black Sea became part of the Golden Horde's domain. Meanwhile, in the east, Mongol campaigns under Urgide and later Mernk continued against the Jin dynasty. The Jin capital at Kaifeng fell in 1234, ending Jurchen rule in northern China. The Song dynasty in the south would face sustained Mongol pressure for decades until its fall in 1279 under Kublai Khan. Material traces of Mongol governance appear across Eurasia. In the Onon Valley, remains of palace platforms and metal workshops mark Karakorum's footprint. In Central Asia, rebuilt sections of Bukhara and Samarkand show layers of 13th century reconstruction. In Rus territories, tribute systems altered economic patterns without immediately destroying local princes' authority. Genghis Khan's legacy was not solely territorial. It lay in the administrative logic that enabled rapid expansion while preserving cohesion. Merit-based promotion, integration of conquered peoples, and pragmatic religious tolerance reduced internal fragmentation. Environmental continuity remains striking. The Kentai Mountains still rise above the Onon River. The Orkhon Valley still supports grazing herds. Yet within these landscapes, political memory shifted. The steppe was no longer peripheral. It became a center from which power radiated outward. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire encompassed the largest contiguous land empire in recorded history. Its foundations were laid in the disciplined order established after 1206. The child born near Dalun Boldog had reshaped Eurasian structure. His successors transformed that structure into sustained imperial presence. The final part of this chapter will examine how historians interpret that legacy, balancing destruction with integration, mobility with governance, memory with material evidence. By the middle of the 13th century, the territories once unified at the Kurultai of 1206 had expanded into a vast imperial system stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the plains of Hungary. Yet the deeper legacy of Genghis Khan did not rest solely in territorial reach. It rested in networks, routes of communication, trade, and governance that connected regions long separated by distance and custom. The Yam relay system, first structured across the Mongolian plateau, became the spine of imperial administration. Under Urgedei and his successors, relay stations extended across Central Asia, Persia, and into Rus lands. Persian chronicler Artamalik Juvini, writing in the 1250s, described mounted couriers traveling remarkable distances using fresh horses at regular intervals. These stations, often simple compounds with timber fencing and storage sheds, maintained supplies of fodder and provisions. In some regions, they were spaced approximately 30 to 40 kilometers apart, adjusted for terrain. Environmental immersion reveals how these routes crossed varied landscapes. In the Gobi Desert, relay stations stood near wells dug into gravel plains. In the Zeravshan Valley near Samarkand, stations were positioned along irrigated canals. In the forests north of the Volga, timber-built posts marked paths through dense woodland. Each environment required adaptation, yet the system remained recognizable. Trade intensified along what later writers would call the Silk Road. Caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals moved with increased security under Mongol protection. In cities such as Bukhara and Tabriz, markets revived. Archaeological excavations in Central Asia have uncovered 13th-century coin hoards bearing Mongol-era inscriptions. Ceramic styles show cross-regional influence, blending Chinese motifs with Persian techniques. Karakorum itself became a meeting point of cultures. William of Rubruck, a Flemish Franciscan who visited in 1254, described a city containing mosques, churches, and Buddhist temples within its walls. He noted metal workshops and a silver tree fountain in the Khan's palace courtyard. While his account reflects later development under Mongol Khan, it illustrates the cosmopolitan character that emerged from foundations laid earlier. Religious tolerance, initiated under Genghis Khan, continued. Buddhist monks from Tibet, Muslim scholars from Transoxiana, Nestorian clergy from Central Asia, and Christian envoys from Europe found space within Mongol domains. This policy was not ideological. It was administrative, reducing resistance and facilitating exchange. Material integration left physical marks. In northern China, sections of the Grand Canal were maintained to ensure grain transport. In Persia, census practices adapted to local bureaucratic traditions. Paper currency experiments expanded under Kublai Khan in Yuan China. These innovations were built upon the mobility and communication structures first solidified after 1206. The environmental breadth of the empire was extraordinary. It included the frozen forests near Lake Baikal, the irrigated orchards of the Amu Darya Basin, the volcanic plateaus of Armenia, and the fertile plains of the Yellow River. Few polities before had managed coherent governance across such diversity. Historians continue to debate the balance between destruction and integration. Urban centers such as Zhongdu and Urgench suffered catastrophic damage during conquest. Archaeological layers of ash and collapse confirm large-scale devastation in early 13th century strata. Yet in subsequent decades, many of these cities were rebuilt under Mongol oversight, becoming nodes in wider exchange networks. The legacy of Genghis Khan cannot be reduced to conquest alone. His structural reforms, merit-based promotion, integration of conquered groups, collective accountability, created a flexible yet disciplined system. Without that structure, later expansion under Urgide, Mernk, and Kublai would likely have fractured. Environmental continuity offers perspective. The Onon River still flows through the Kentiai Mountains. Stone mounds marking ancient burials remain scattered across Mongolian grasslands. Excavations in the Orkhon Valley continue to uncover fragments of 13th century workshops and foundations. These material traces anchor narrative in physical landscape. Genghis Khan's burial place remains undiscovered. Surveys in the Kentiai region have identified numerous elite graves, some 2 to 3 meters deep and covered by stone cairns, yet none can be definitively linked to him. The absence of monumental tomb contrasts sharply with emperors of sedentary states whose mausoleums dominate landscapes. In that absence lies part of his legacy. The empire he founded was not rooted in stone monuments, it was rooted in movement and structure. The final section reflects on how modern scholarship interprets this transformation, not through legend, but through measured analysis of records, sites, and systems. Today, the story of Genghis Khan is reconstructed from layered sources. The secret history of the Mongols, compiled in the mid-13th century, Persian chronicles such as those of Artamalik Juvini and Rashid al-Din, Chinese dynastic records from the Jin and Yuan courts, and the physical record left in soil and stone across Eurasia. The secret history, likely written around 1240, preserves intimate details of Temujin's childhood near the Onon River and his struggles with the Tayachiad. Though composed within the ruling Mongol milieu, it offers glimpses of early life: bone fishhooks along riverbanks, wooden kangs used in captivity, oath rituals sworn under open sky. Persian sources, written from the perspective of conquered territories, record siege descriptions of Bukhara and Samarkand, knotting collapsed walls and burned quarters. Chinese records document the fall of Zhongdu in 1215 and the eventual defeat of the Jin in 1234. Archaeology reinforces written accounts. In the Orkhon Valley, excavations at Karakorum reveal kiln remains, iron slag from metal workshops, and fragments of glazed roof tiles imported or produced under Chinese influence. At sites near Yinchuan, burned brick layers correspond to 13th century destruction. In Central Asia, strata in Urgench and Samarkand contain evidence of abrupt transition in early 1220s levels, collapsed structures, hoarded coinage, and rapid reconstruction phases. Environmental immersion remains essential in interpreting legacy. The Kentiai Mountains still stand forested and remote. The Onon River flows through quiet valleys. The Orkhon Valley supports grazing herds much as it did in 1206. In Ningxia, irrigation channels continue to draw water from the Yellow River beneath the Helan Mountains. The landscapes that shaped and witnessed these events remain physically present. Modern scholarship has shifted away from viewing Genghis Khan solely through lens of destruction. While the conquests of 1211–1227 brought severe urban devastation, they also reconfigured long-distance exchange. Trade routes linking China, Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe operated with unprecedented security under Mongol oversight. The relay system allowed communication across more than 8,000 kilometers of territory. Measured analysis of administrative continuity shows that many regional elites remained in place under Mongol supervision. Taxation systems adapted to local conditions. Religious communities retained autonomy. The decimal military structure influenced successor states even after the empire fragmented into the Yuan, Ilkhanate, Chagatai Khanate, and Golden Horde. The scale of territorial reach remains unmatched among contiguous land empires. From the Pacific coast to the Carpathian Basin, Mongol authority, direct or tributary, spanned diverse climates and cultures. Yet its coherence depended on structures built during the formative years between 1206 and 1227. Genghis Khan's legacy rests not in mythic exaggeration but in institutional durability. He replaced aristocratic fragmentation with merit-based integration. He created a communication network capable of spanning deserts and mountains. He enforced discipline without constructing permanent stone capitals. His system survived succession and expanded beyond his lifetime. The absence of a known tomb underscores the nature of his rule. Unlike emperors buried beneath monumental mausoleums, he left no visible shrine. His memory persists instead in legal traditions, military organization, and cross-cultural networks. In the Kentai Mountains, wind continues to move across grass and forest. In the Orkhon Valley, archaeological teams uncover fragments of workshops and palace foundations. In Samarkand and Bukhara, 13th-century layers remain embedded beneath later construction. The story that began near Daloon Boldog in the 1160s unfolded across rivers, the Onon, the Yellow River, the Amu Darya, the Khalkha, and across deserts and plains. It was shaped by climate, movement, and structure. When Genghis Khan was proclaimed in 1206, the steppe entered a new phase of political organization. By the time of his death in 1227, that organization had altered the balance of Eurasia. The grasslands that formed him remain quiet. The systems he created reshaped continents. And in that measured transformation lies the enduring record of his life.